right. Good morning. We'll go ahead and get started. So this is the first meeting of the Technical Advisory Council for the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resilience Program that was created under Senate Bill 246. And thank you to everyone for being here on this Monday morning, at least it's not raining. And so I think what we'll do to start, so Ken Alex, the Director of OPR, is here we'll give a welcome, but I think it would be nice to just go around the table and hear who is here. I know a few people will still be trickling in with traffic and things like that. Should I make a note at this moment that we are recording the meeting? So, and then everyone is, so it's being recorded and there's a little video as well. So, so again, I'm Louise Bedsworth with OPR.
And do I need to speak in for the recording? Yeah. Brian Strong, Chief Resilience Officer with the City and County of San Francisco.
Jason Greenspan, I'm the Manager of Sustainability for the Southern California Association of Governments.
Bruce Burden, I'm the Program Director for the Climate Readiness Institute at UC Berkeley.
Hi, good morning. I'm Sakita Grant, Legal Counsel for the Environmental Equity Team at the Green Mining Institute.
Hi, Maureen Frank, Deputy County Administrator for Tuolumne County.
Hi, Kaylee Ebright with the Natural Resources Agency, Deputy for Climate and Energy.
I'm Jana Gagnon, Sustainability Director for the Blue Lake Rancheria Tribe, the federally recognized Native American tribe in Northern California.
Hi, I'm Tapan Patak. I'm with the UNESCO California Cooperative Extension, work on climate adaptation in agriculture.
Hi, I'm Betsy Hammer with the California State Association of Counties, sitting in today for Kara Martinson.
Hi, Michael Carroll with the Rural Community Assistance Corporation. We're a nonprofit organization based here in West Sacramento, but we serve all of California.
Hi, Tina Curry, Deputy Director, Governor's Office of Emergency Services.
Louis Bloomberg, the Nature Conservancy.
Kit Batten with Pacific Gas and Electric.
Hi, good morning. Gloria Walton with SCOPE from Los Angeles, Strategic Concepts in Organizing and Policy Education.
Hi, I'm Mike Antos. I'm a watershed manager with the Santa Ana Watershed Project Authority and one of the founders of the Mediterranean Cities Climate Change Consortium.
Good morning. Ashley Conrad-Seda, Deputy Secretary for Climate Policy at the California Environmental Protection Agency.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Andrea Aus. I'm the Community and Economic Development Director for the City of Vallejo.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Ken Alex. I'm the Director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. So thank you so much for being here. It's incredibly diverse group. It kind of underscores both the possibilities and the challenge. Well, let me start. I also want to thank Senator Wieckowski. He's one of the main reasons we're all here in light of his legislation. He's going to come by early in the afternoon and say hello to everybody as well. So thank you to him and his staff. The Office of Planning and Research under the new law was tasked with putting together this august group. And so we're very pleased that very strong response from everybody. I think it underscores really the importance and the immediacy of the set of issues that the advisory committee is going to deal with. So look, unlike the federal government, we take climate change seriously. We know that the issue is here. And nobody, I think, knows that in California more than the local governments that deal with this set of issues already and have to really incorporate this set of challenges into their planning as we move into the future. So it's really essential to have local governments working with the state. The state, as you know, the governor has made this one of his biggest priorities, but exactly how we deal with the set of issues that we're confronted with as we move forward, the inevitable level of climate change impacts. We have 900 miles of coastline. We have 30% of our water supply in a snowpack that's at the climate change point where it could easily become rain instead of snow. We have challenges of drought. We have challenges of flood. We've got it all. So, and each piece has a regional aspect to it. I think we're a little bit ahead of the curve because we have 5 regional associations looking at this set of issues, and about to be 6 from what I hear with the addition of the Central Coast. And so we have some advantages that people have been thinking about this set of issues for a while, but this is still a very profound challenge. And so your role, I think, is really essential. What should the state be doing, and what should the state know about what the challenges are at the local level? And so for me, a couple of priorities. Nuntara and Louise, I'm sure, will have their own, and as you all will. But for me, by the time you're through your first year, I'd be very interested in knowing what your priorities are. What are the short-term challenges that rise to the top? And the same for medium and long-term. And what can we say are particularly statewide issues, and what are more appropriate either regionally or very locally? I think if you can scope all that out, that would be hugely beneficial for thinking about where we go next. And then, of course, the elephant, I think, for all of us is how do we fund what is a very profound set of challenges? Are there financing opportunities that we may need to think about? And, even starting to think about what the scope of funding the set of challenges will be. And then how do we integrate all of this into state decision-making, regional decision-making, local decision-making? We're working on this set of issues, but we really need your help in thinking it through. So pretty steep challenges, as usual, in the world of climate, but I'm certain you are all up to it, and really very, very pleased to have you all here, and I wish you the best of luck with your efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great. So I think just to give folks a sense of where we're headed over the course of the day, sort of building off of what Ken was saying, is the intention of today's meeting is we'll spend the morning reviewing the bill itself, sort of what the enabling statute is, a draft charter for this group, and then about really how we envision this council and the program more generally. This council is part of a larger, this integrated climate adaptation and resilience program, which also has a clearinghouse component to it, how that fits into our broader adaptation and resilience efforts at the state level, but then also to hear how it can fit with work at the local and regional level. We'll then break for lunch, and then at 1 o'clock, Senator Wajkowski is going to come and speak to the council as well. And then we'll go into the afternoon to talk about what a work plan for this group could look like over the coming, it could be we decide we just want to scope out the next meeting. It could be we want to map out a full year. So that'll really be an opportunity for discussion that we, Nuntara and others, have brought 3 topics that are pretty timely and relevant where we maybe could dive in on a specific issue. We don't have to agree that we want to do any of those. We could say we want to do something else, but it really is intended to get the conversation going and really think about how this council, which is a pretty new endeavor for us, can fit in, and how it can assist the state, how it can assist local and regional governments, and just be a really overall, take advantage of this opportunity. So I think this is a pretty new structure where we have all of us in one room, and the intention is to have a two-way street of communication and coordination. And so that will lead into the afternoon. As we'll talk in a minute, this is, because it was created under statute, subject to Bagley-Keene public meeting rules, and so we will follow the process of where we have items having public comment, and then close the day with a general public comment period as well. For folks who are attending the meeting, members of the public, there is a sign-in sheet that is optional, but there is a sign-in sheet out in the front, and you can indicate if you'd like to continue to receive updates on the work of the council. And so if there are items on the agenda that you want to speak to, there are public comment cards that you can complete and give to Gareth over here. And then I think that covers most. The other, I guess, important logistics. The restrooms are out the door and to the left. There's also a water dispenser out there. And in the case of an emergency, we leave the building in an orderly fashion and we go to the park, which is like right over there. But you can follow someone if you don't know where to go. So I think that covers, is that okay? So I'm getting, yes, that covers pretty much most of the logistics. And we will go ahead and dive in and I think start with Nuantara giving an overview of Senate Bill 246 and the enabling statute.
Can you all, okay, great, that's on. So thank you all again for being here, and my name is Nuantara Key, and I'm a Resilience Program Manager at OPR, and so I'm very excited to get to work with you all and to be working on this exciting program as we get it up and going. So as Louise mentioned, I'm going to give an overview of Senate Bill 246 and the pieces of the program that are called out, of the ICARP program that are called out in the legislation, just for setting a little bit of context. As Louise mentioned, we'll have a lot of time later on in the day to really dive into the details of how we want this work to move forward and how you want this to move forward, but just kind of setting the stage and an overview of the legislation. So as both Ken and Louise have mentioned, the purpose of the legislation and of the ICARP program generally is really to look at how do we coordinate our state, local, and regional activities around climate adaptation, really with an eye towards local implementation. So how do we move forward in local implementation, recognizing kind of the importance of a local context and local needs. A couple cross-cutting, what I've called cross-cutting objectives that are called out in the legislation that I think are important for us to highlight here is one is advancing equity and environmental justice within the context of our climate adaptation work. And the second is really figuring out how do we support an integrated approach to climate change and our climate change work generally. So where do we find synergies and opportunities to connect our mitigation and our adaptation work as well. So those are kind of two broad themes that are in the legislation that I think we can discuss and figure out how do we move those forward within the context of our work. So as Louise mentioned, the clearinghouse, there are two key elements to the ICARP program. So the first that I'll go over is the clearinghouse, the adaptation clearinghouse that we're hosting and building on the OPR website. I've included the link here down at the bottom. But the intent of the clearinghouse is really to provide resources that can help guide and inform local implementation of adaptation and resiliency throughout the state and within the local context. So, we're looking to really provide links and resources on the best available science and research, really wanting to promote decision-making that's based on the best available information. So we'll be linking and connecting the clearinghouse to CalAdapt, which is the state's, through the Energy Commission, the state's site that includes downscaled climate change data and information. So we'll be linking there. The second is around policy guidance and decision support tools. So linking to other, excuse me, state-led efforts such as the Adaptation Planning Guide. So really looking at how do we support local decision-making and provide tools and resources. Another key area that we're very excited about at OPR is putting together a series of case studies and stories that really highlight how people and communities local governments around the state are starting to implement around local adaptation and resiliency within their communities. And we really feel that there's tremendous value in making sure that we're kind of supporting a community of practice through the clearinghouse and really helping to highlight how are people finding creative solutions and opportunities to the challenges that they're facing as we're moving forward. And also, you know, through the case studies and stories, connecting kind of to the human side of this work and the importance of the work. So we will, I'll just mention that the clearinghouse, the link here, and the existing site is very much a beginning to the clearinghouse. We're working right now on a contract to really build a robust and more dynamic site that is more interactive in terms of being able to go in and look for resources by a certain geography or location or by a certain impact area. And we'll definitely be coming back to you as the council to make sure that what we're providing and the resources that are on the clearinghouse meet the needs of local communities throughout the state. And then the second piece of the program is why we're all here today, the Technical Advisory Council. So again, we really see this opportunity, as Luis mentioned, the council as an opportunity for a two-way dialogue between the state and local communities, the local partners, to really understand how we move implementation forward around climate adaptation. A couple important pieces from our perspective for the program and the council generally are, you know, helping us understand how do we balance kind of immediate needs with our long-term goals and making sure that the actions we're taking today to respond to local community needs are also building towards where we need to go in the long term in the context of a changing climate. The second, as we've talked about, is, you know, supporting policy alignment between state and local perspective. As Ken mentioned in his opening remarks too, identifying early key leverage points. So where are there opportunities where if we focus our attention today can really help us move this work forward and help support local implementation. And similarly, you know, looking for ways and strategies where we can institutionalize adaptation into the work that we're already doing. So it isn't seen as a standalone, it isn't something separate from our day-to-day, but really is part of how we think about the work that we do. So I will stop there, and my contact information, if anybody has any questions, you know, please contact and let me know. Always here, and now we can open it up if there are any questions.
Are there any questions? Sakita?
Great, thank you. Thank you for hosting us and kind of bringing us together. I know it was a lot of legwork to get here. A quick clarifying question. As it stated on your slides for SB 246, the two cross-cutting objectives, one of them is to advance equity and environmental justice. And I wanted to know, kind of as you're looking at the ICARP overview on that slide, where that piece gets called out, or is this something that you all are envisioning is more embedded in kind of this effort around more coordination and connecting with local adaptation implementation efforts? Because I noticed it's called out in 246, but not in kind of describing what the overview of this, the purpose of this advisory committee is.
So from my perspective, I would see it, and you know, how we've been thinking about it is making sure that it's present across the work that we're doing throughout the entire program, including for the council. So making sure that it is a part of the conversations and the work that we're doing throughout, not as a standalone kind of separate piece from the other elements of the program. So on the adaptation clearinghouse, making sure that we have case studies and information that is helping to support environmental justice and equity outcomes, as well as making sure that it is part of our discussion here as the council.
It's helpful, and that makes sense. I think that we should, because I know being on other advisory committees, it is helpful sometimes to have it called out, but to your point, you don't want it like siloed in a way that maybe isn't well integrated into everything. So I think this sounds good, and then maybe we'll check in later to see, does it feel like, it's not something that's being forgotten, but it is kind of at the forefront of what we're doing because, we all know the science behind and where the marginalized groups are, and so making sure that that's kind of at the forefront of our minds as we're thinking about this. Thank you.
Great. Louis?
Yeah, I just had a question, maybe more of a comment. So the legislation uses the word support, and you did too, Nuantara. So the council here is to support the ICARP, and that to me is a very broad and open word. And I think as we go through today and talk about the work plan, it would be helpful to clarify, how much, what the role of the council is vis-a-vis the ICARP itself and what that really means. And the other thing I'm struck by is having sat in this room last year with many of you, some of the same people around the TAG group, the Technical Advisory Group, that worked on a guidance document that produced resources in the various in the box. So I think it's important that both this council and the ICARP not reinvent the wheel and draw on all of the to the extent possible, the work that's already been done on this topic. So it's not starting from scratch, and just want to call that out now.
Yeah, just a basic logistical request. And you may have done this months ago. I apologize if you have. If you could circulate to the members the list and contacts for all the members, as well as the staff involved in their roles. Appreciate it.
A contact list. Yeah, we can do that. Everyone, it is available online, but we can make it a document that everyone can have.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions or comments from the council? Any public comments or questions? Okay, thank you, Nuantara. So I think next we will move on to talk through, the next item is to talk through the charter for this group, which everyone should have a copy of, and there's a copy on the table, should have been sent with the appointment as well. And the intention of the charter was just to give a broad sense of what is the role and the objectives of this group, the makeup of the group, what the membership will look like, and also to bring in some of the specific areas of expertise, et cetera, that are called out in the legislation. So I can just walk through some of the main points of the charter, and then we can open it up for question and discussion. This will be something we'll vote on as a group to accept, so we can make changes or edits as we go if folks feel that they're necessary. And so again, Senate Bill 246 directs OPR to establish the Integrated Climate Adaptation Resilience Program to coordinate regional and local efforts with state climate adaptation strategies to adapt to the impacts of climate change. That's our in code. The Technical Advisory Council is one component, and it should be led by OPR with a primary focus on supporting OPR's goals to facilitate coordination among state, regional, and local agency efforts. So it is quite broad. The membership is all appointed by the director of OPR, Alex. And right now the members are appointed for a one-year term, and then they will be reviewed and membership needs annually. Any council member can designate an alternate, so if you're not able to come, feel free to send someone in your place, and they should have the authority to vote on issues. We have a number of areas of expertise that were called out in the legislation, and so all of you, we don't have specific seats, but the mix of membership was intended to address that broad range of expertise that were laid out, but also to gather, to get representation across local and regional governments, tribal government, non-governmental organizations, to get regional diversity, and so that is the makeup. The structure includes, like I said, local and regional governments, collaborative organizations, some community members at large, and then, of course, state agency members as well. So the council leadership, the OPR director will designate a chair and a vice chair. At this point, we have a chair. That is me. If we decide we want a vice chair, we will designate one. And so oversee meetings. And then the council can establish committees and working groups as necessary. It is important to note, because we are subject to Bagley-Keene open meeting rules, any meeting of more than 2 members of the council to discuss business or items that will be brought to the council needs to be a public meeting. And so that should not be viewed as a hurdle, but we will just have to think about that in logistical terms, because there are requirements if we do webinars and things like that of how we structure them, but we can assist with that. So just wanted to call that out. So that is the work committees. So we right now are scheduling 4 meetings a year. This first meeting is here in Sacramento, but we would like to hold meetings in other locations and use those meetings as opportunities to engage with work that is happening around the state. And so as we look forward, would love to work with council members to think about opportunities to meet in other regions so that we get as much engagement and interaction around the state as possible, but also the opportunity to bring in more people to speak and present at the meetings. So we will have minutes prepared after every meeting that will be shared for approval. So when it's necessary, so I'm sorry, so that was the meetings section. Now moving on to decision making. So when we're voting, we'll seek to get consensus wherever we can. Otherwise, we'll just be making decisions by majority vote. And each member will have 1 vote, either cast by themselves or their designated alternate. OPR will staff this council. Nguyen Tara has been leading this effort with Greta Seuss. And Sam Diaz is helping as well, who I think I saw. But we will send everyone's contact information, and so you have contacts for thinking about logistics of meetings, materials, et cetera. The council has funded, was appropriated funds to support this, the OPR was appropriated funds to support this council. And so any member who would like reimbursement for travel expenses should contact Nguyen Tara. And we have funds to assist with travel to meetings. So the duties of the council, again, are quite broad. To support OPR's work to facilitate coordination among state, regional, and local agency efforts, to promote integrated climate actions. And so that's been a big topic of what is an integrated climate action, really trying to think about how we address climate in a holistic way. So I think of that both thinking about how we work mitigation and adaptation and resilience together, but also integrated across scale, so integrated across state, local, and regional. So really trying to think holistically about how we support climate action. And then also to support adaptation and resiliency efforts that advance equity and environmental justice. So those are really the broad duties of the group. And I think especially the last one, Sakita, with your question, I think would be helpful to bring that back up in this afternoon's conversation too about work plan and as we think about the topics. So that is the simple charter for the group. And it can be, we'll vote on it today, but we can always modify it again with a vote of the council if we decide we need to. So in terms of procedure, we take comments from the questions from the council. Sir. Yes, Ashley. Oh, sorry, I didn't see that one.
I'm just wondering if there's room to bring those 2 objectives of equity, advancing equity and environmental justice, and the integration up into scope and objectives. I think because it seems like something that a lot of us feel really critically about, that it makes sense to have it somewhere up there in scope and objectives. Maybe another just could be added to the end here.
Okay.
Primary focus on, and then the quote, you know, with those 2 other objectives called out.
Okay, so adding the equity and EJ.
Equity, EJ, and integration.
And integration,
those
okay.
2 objectives, and whatever language comes from the statute, maybe you can just put right in there.
I was just actually wondering, with the membership expertise areas, do we have, are all of those expertise areas filled at this point, or are there additional members needed to fill them?
So, yes, we feel like they are covered.
Okay.
I don't know that, we don't have, because we didn't do specific seats, the intention was in making the membership that folks work or expertise or responsibility touches on all of them. I think if there are areas we feel are not well represented, that is something we as a group should discuss, and we can always go back and ask to have new members appointed. And so that, I think, is something we should certainly keep in mind, and important to keep these areas of expertise list, in your mind as we think about things. And so the intention was to try to balance to keep a manageable size of a group and all of that. But I think if we do feel like there is something that is not adequately addressed with the current membership, anyone can raise that to the council or to one of us directly offline if you'd rather do that.
Okay, and one thing that might be helpful too is, for those of us, for all of us in the room to think about which areas you could cover, right? So, so if it feels like you're probably slotted in one area, what other areas could you comment on too, if there's not anyone specifically in the room with that background? And I was looking, at recycling and waste management, for example. It'd be good to make sure we have that covered in a number of ways, because it touches on not only municipal solid waste, but also, generally speaking, if you want to call it waste, the ag sector, forestry sector, and wastewater treatment, things like that. So it would be good for everyone to just kind of look through that list and assign themselves a couple of roles.
Well, and to that, I think if folks would like to do that, we could also, on the list of members, sort of indicate, I think right now it has your name and a bio. We could also put areas of expertise that you feel comfortable representing, and so if folks want to get us that information, we can add that to our online list and then the list that we circulate and share among the group. Any other? Oh.
Yeah, I think this is a very good document. My comment, and maybe it's a comment better later for the ICARP itself, but I'll make it here. I think it suffers from the same thing that we suffer from all the time in adaptation work, which is there's a lot of what we're going to do, but there's nothing here about to what end. What is, on the GHG side, and Louise, you've heard this from me as a broken record for at least a year. On the GHG side in climate work in California, we have some very strong and aspirational and practical goals that we're working towards. And then we talk about all the many great things we're going to do to get there. We're still on adaptation doing a whole bunch of things without a sense of where we're going or what we'd like to see. And I think that's a problem both for our work and a problem for getting people interested in what we're doing or to join us to see that it's got an aspiration, it's going somewhere. And I know that this is a tougher issue for adaptation to quantify it and all, but maybe even something, I was thinking on the way up here, that we're going to create the best damn adaptation program in the world. It's something that would give us a little pizzazz to go with all the very good practical stuff that's here, or that we're going to make California #1 in climate adaptation and resilience, whatever that means, but that's where we're headed. That'd be my comment for now.
Thank you.
I have a quick kind of process question. So I like the kind of call out of the value of having work committees. I think that could be really effective moving forward. But I'm wondering how that works with Bagley-Keene. If it's more than 2 people, that seems really low. And so does that mean that a work committee would have to be publicly noticed every meeting? Like if there were like subgroups?
Yes. Yeah, and actually, so next, New and Tara will go through some of the basics of Bagley-Keene, but yes, it does. And there are certainly ways we can deal with that. Like I said, I think it raises logistical challenges, but yes, so any meeting with more than 2 people, we will need to publicly notice and make publicly accessible. And do you want to, I'm sorry, because you want to introduce yourself, that would be great.
Thank you. Martin Gonzalez, I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Local Government. My question has to do in terms of OPR's working definition of the word coordination in this context here.
what is our, so, I mean, I think that is an excellent question. I mean, I think part of it is, and I will answer and then I would welcome colleagues of mine to answer as well, is really how do we, I think there's an element of alignment to it, how to better align state, local, and regional activities. I think it is also sort of this two-way street of learning from what is happening. We know with adaptation and resilience, there's a lot happening at the local level as well as at the state level. So how do we learn from what's happening on the ground and use that to inform what's happening at the what the state is doing, and vice versa. And in a way, I also think of it, this is not, this is a good question and one I don't have a very formal answer to. I think it's sort of just smoothing the interaction or sort of greasing the wheels to get things working better so that we are facilitating work happening on the ground. And whether that is led by a state entity, a federal partner, or a local partner, in the end, trying to get that work happening on the ground. So that, I don't know if others like to chime in.
And this is Ashley Conrad-Seda from Kelly PA, but just to support OPR, I think the coordinate title works really well for them because they do sit in a place where they work often with local and regional government and obviously are an entity of the governor's office and state. And they also, in terms of subject matter expertise, can sort of cross multiple different subject matters. So it's sort of the right place for this coordinate role. They're probably the best state agency to do that. So I'd say I see coordinate also as the role of bringing together multiple areas of expertise in a neutral way, so without bias for one particular area over another.
We often think of it as dot connecting, a lot of what we talk about that we do. So some of it is that, is making sure, and like if we have a issue that comes before the council, we can bring the right people to the table or, things like that. So.
Yeah, just to follow up on a point that Bruce mentioned, I think we talked a lot about coordination and implementation, but in order to document the impact, positive impact of the programs, I think that is critical for implementing and maybe making it more operational. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the suggestions for this committee to think about. I mean, for mitigation, there are specific goals and they're a little bit easier to achieve compared to adaptation part. And probably as a group, we should be thinking about how we should document those impact on the adaptation side.
And again, this is Ashley Conrad-Seda from Kelly PA, but following up on Bruce's comment too, I think that obviously I work much more on the mitigation side, and so we have targets and goals and numbers, and many of those are aspirational. And so I don't think it's a problem to set aspirational adaptation or resilience goals, and that could be low-hanging fruit, such as we want to make sure that a particular sector is resiliently designed, and it could be more aspirational that you're thinking about entire communities or entire subsets of communities that have adaptation principles baked into them. So I shouldn't really admit that our mitigation goals are so aspirational, but we have to go big. We have really big climate goals, and a lot of what we're saying is modeled, but we don't necessarily know that those things will occur. And so we can think about that in this setting as well, that we don't have a perfect vision for the future, and we won't. But I think it's wise to start thinking about what the low-hanging fruit is that we believe we can accomplish, as Ken was saying, in the short term, and that what some of those aspirational goals are. How do we define adaptation and resilience in the long run for either given sectors or given areas or given communities? So, when you're making these drives back and forth to the meetings or train riding or taking your bus and bike path trips, be thinking about those too, what those goals could be that are more aspirational.
That's really helpful, and I'll look a little bit to Nuntara with the process. I actually wonder if thinking about because I think that is our perennial challenge, as you said, Bruce, that we don't have a 2050 target. We don't have the 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. Is something that this group could do, and I don't know that it, is try to set what that vision would look like, and what that vision would look like from all the different perspectives that are represented here in the room, and we can roll that up, and that could be something that can inform the work that is happening at the local level as well as at the state level. So I don't know the process by which we have that discussion. It could happen this afternoon, but I think could be a really valuable piece to that, and what we could on the charter, we could sort of leave a placeholder for it if we wanted. If we feel like that's the main thing that's missing, we make a few changes of the other things that were mentioned. Are there any other comments from Gloria?
Yeah, so to Bruce's point, Martin's as well as Ashley's, so to Bruce's point, I think that there's an opportunity, exactly what you said, Luis, around visioning, where we can actually have some type of vision and articulate a vision that's simple, that has equity and kind of climate justice principles at the heart of it. And I think that we would be tasked with really trying to define what that means to us, because what I don't want to assume is that we all think about equity the same way, that we all think about environmental justice the same way, that we think about climate adaptation and resilience the same way. So I think that there's some kind of core vocabulary that we should just equalize knowledge and understanding around, or at least achieve some type of agreement. And to Martin's point around coordination, I know for us and probably a couple other folks in this space, we're networked with other groups like the California Climate Equity Coalition, which is essentially a bunch of folks and organizations and agencies who are interested in climate equity, fighting for climate equity and climate justice. CEJA, the California Environmental Justice Alliance, which is an alliance of community-based organizations throughout the state who actually have these kinds of principles that are centric to their model. So I just think that we should be representing in ways that are tapped into our networks and bringing back information here. And I guess that's kind of the interplay that will be happening and a basic sense of what coordination can look like and the responsibility we have to bring things back to broader networks, and then touching those networks and bringing things back to this space. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
Yeah. Any other council member comments? Any public comments on the charter? So,
So in terms of a potential next step in kind of the process, I would maybe suggest as a potential action here is that we bring the equity, environmental justice language and the integration language up to the front as was suggested, and then as kind of a takeaway next step that we'll send out the list of council members' contact information and ask you all to kind of self-identify the sectors or area expertise as was discussed, and we'll include that in the distribution list as well as put it on the website. And then in terms of moving forward with adopting the charter, propose putting a placeholder for that visioning language, the kind of aspirational goals language, and that we start that conversation this afternoon when we're talking about the work plan and the kind of priorities for this next, for this coming year in the afternoon discussion, and that we take that discussion and then any other subsequent ones, as was suggested, through reaching out to networks, and that we figure out what that process is, but then we build that in and bring that into the charter once we get that language and get your perspective on it at a subsequent meeting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally agree. And just to add one amendment to the visioning piece, I think the values and or principles addendum would be important as well.
Great. Yeah.
Do we just vote?
So, yeah, so if people are comfortable with that and okay with voting on that, then
we need a motion. We're new to this.
I will move the amendment as stated.
Okay.
I'll second.
And then we do have to record how everyone votes, so if you just could hold your hand up for, so all those in favor? Okay, any opposed? Any abstains? Okay. So sorry, well, it'll all get smoother. So now we can have our overview of Bagley-Keene to get to some of these logistic questions, which I think we'll continue to revisit, but Nuantara can give the highlights.
We'll give the highlights, and then I will also just say that I am not an expert in this, so if there are specific questions that we need to take, and I can follow up following afterward. Yeah, so as Luis mentioned, the intent with the Bagley-Keene is really to provide the public an opportunity to participate and engage in the conversation as the council moves forward. And so we'll be posting all the meeting notices, the agenda, materials 10 days in advance of the meeting on our website. And then, as Luis mentioned, for the work groups, any work group of 3 or more, so more than 2 members, will need to be public. And again, we can work through how, if the council decides that you want to move forward with subcommittees or work groups, how we support that. In terms of having webinars, they need to have public access, and we can talk through the logistics of that. But just making sure that we're really providing the public, as this council is deliberating and doing the work, your work as a group, the public has an opportunity to engage and participate. One thing that we should be aware of is the serial meetings. So we'll try to explain this as clearly as I can. So individual council members cannot meet with one-on-one with the entire council to try to get around those public deliberative conversation dialogue. So you can have meetings with one another and you can communicate, but you cannot be deliberating about agenda items or items within the jurisdiction of this council one-on-one to get around that public dialogue. And you also cannot ask someone else to do that on your behalf. So, yeah, so the Act also guarantees public participation, speaking for each of the agenda items, as well as an open general public comment period at the end of each of the meetings. I think that's it in terms of kind of the general takeaways. So for the Bagley-Keene.
Thanks. Are there questions? My sense is we'll probably, Ashley, you want
Yeah, no, I have a question, but mostly because, like, looking around this room, I work with many of you. How do we, and we work on adaptation and resilience, and we talk about it regularly, which is obviously falls under the definition of this group. So, I mean, how do we manage that? Like, I talk to Mo regularly with the 3 of us, right? Regularly. How do we manage that if it's a topic that falls under this group but is not
our attorney?
Thank you.
I'm Sandy Goldberg. I'm counsel for OPR. You can have conversations one-on-one about the topics that the council addresses. What you can't do is have those conversations with certain members and then go and have another separate conversation with some other members. So you're never meeting with a majority of the council at one time, but what you're really trying to do is to convince a majority of the council, this is the right thing to do about this issue, and form, a consensus on something that the council is going to be addressing. So, yeah.
To clarify, so that means, in my understanding, this is Kit Batten from PG&E, that should 4 of us meet about climate adaptation, but not necessarily pertaining to the deliberations or procedures being discussed in this committee, that's okay?
Yes.
And excuse me, just for further clarification, so for me, what I'm hearing is essentially we just can't organize a vote, right?
Yeah, although it's not limited to something that is, on an upcoming agenda where you're going to be voting. I think it's more broadly where it's subject matters where you because you might be addressing, it's within your work plan. It's something you're trying to carry out because it's in your work plan. So I think you have to use your judgment, but it doesn't mean that you can't stop doing your normal jobs, by any sense.
Go ahead. If you have questions or something comes up and you want to touch base, definitely be in contact, and we can help support and get to the bottom of a specific question if it comes up.
Yeah. Be smarter than the microphone. As it relates to email, so for those of us who don't get in the same room and talk but are reliant upon email, can you talk a little bit about the reply to all button?
Yep. So digital communication falls under the same requirements as in-person conversation. So, if you were, rather than meeting with an individual or individuals from the council in those serial meetings, if you were also to email them in place of meeting in person, that would still count as a serial meeting, so that would not be allowed. So any communication that, my understanding, Cindy can correct me if I'm wrong, but deliberative discussions or communication of the council that happens as a group, even through kind of digital communication, would need to be posted publicly or provided publicly and allow the public an opportunity to see that conversation and then participate.
Just further clarification for emails, which are discoverable and which are not. For example, if there are 4 members talking in the normal course of business about a particular topic that may or may not end up before us, would those emails, both from a personal device and from a business device, be discoverable?
Yes.
Questions? Yes.
More clarifying. I think I know the answer, but if, say we have, say there's like a subgroup working on rural community issues or something like that, and say there's 4 or 5 of us, and we meet maybe with other experts in the space as more of an informational kind of opportunity, not that we're deliberating on any specific topic. Is that okay?
I think it's okay, but I'm looking at Sandy over here to make sure that the meeting would need to be open to the public to participate or listen and engage, participate if possible. Is that correct? We'll get Sandy to.
I think if you're just attending a meeting for informational purposes and it's on the general subject of adaptation, that's okay.
Where does the responsibility for compliance lie? Is it with OPR or is it with each of us individually? For noticing and all that other stuff.
We'll be responsible for noticing and putting it on our website, but in terms of compliance, you as council members are responsible for making sure that your activities are compliant with the intent of bag leaking.
Thanks.
Questions? And like I said, I think it could pose logistical challenges to any, but we are definitely committed to working with everyone to overcome those, and so we can make things work and make sure that we have accessibility and for the public and everything with our efforts. Are there any public questions or comments on the bag leaking piece? Okay, so I think that was really more informational. Just continue as questions come up. Feel free to let us know. Great. Okay, so the last item before we break for lunch, and if we're able to get out a little, give everyone a little extra time, that would be great, because we will start up again, like I said, at 1 o'clock with Senator Wajkowski, so we kind of all would like to be fairly prompt for that. I just wanted to give a little quick overview of some of the state's adaptation and resilience efforts, but also look to a number of colleagues here in the room who can speak to this as well. So hopefully this will just give a sense of how we're envisioning this council and the ICARP program more generally situated in the space of adaptation and resilience efforts that are going on here at the state. So I'll start with the fact, so folks are probably familiar with Safeguarding California. That is our state's climate adaptation strategy. Most recently, and it is led by the California Natural Resources Agency. It is a plan that was last updated in 2014 and looks across 10 sectors, well 9 and then a 10th was added with our most recent implementation action plans. Basically for every sector looks at the overview of climate risks and actions that are underway or planned to address those risks. Through Executive Order B3015, which was signed in April of 2015, every sector lead was directed to develop an implementation action plan, and so those were published, and there's a compendium of them available on the Natural Resources Agency website that really looks at how do we take this plan and make it not just a plan but something that will become action, and what are the milestones and that we have for achieving that sector by sector, and then the Natural Resources Agency has been tracking the progress. Right now, there is a 27 update, at the same time that Senate Bill 246 was passed, Assembly Bill 1482 was also passed and signed that required an update to Safeguarding California every 3 years. And the update is underway right now, and there will be a public draft available later on in the spring and completed over this coming year. So a lot of outreach and work that will be happening around this plan in the coming year, but it really is a guiding document for the state's adaptation and resilience efforts. So when we think about, and this is our ever-evolving diagram of how to organize activities. So really when we think about what does it mean, I like to think of Safeguarding California not just as a document, but really as a concept. What does it mean if we're trying to safeguard California in the face of changing climate? And it really means touching on what we do at the state, what we're doing at the state, how we're investing in infrastructure, how we're operating, what our funding programs look like, how we're doing planning, how we're providing guidance, really how do we embed it in all of our functions at the state, this concept of planning and preparing for a changing future. But also then what is happening at the local and regional level. Like I said, we know a lot of local governments have been out really in front of the state on a lot of this, and so we're looking at what's happening with the general plans, what's happening with adaptation plans. There's, as Ken mentioned, 5 regional collaboratives around the state that have organized around climate adaptation, and so those are all activities that are really critical for getting those things happening on the ground and developing projects and plans that are more resilient and are accounting for changing climate. And then all of this is really supported by a lot of research and tool development, which is led at the state level, but then also is happening at the local and regional level. So right now we have a 4th climate change assessment happening for the state, where we've been able to invest in a whole suite of projects looking at the impacts of climate change on California, but then what are steps needed to address those changes across different sectors and different regions. We already talked about CalAdapt, which is a tool to make downscale climate projections available. And so just a lot going on around how do we enable action through research and tool development. So the next, so when we think about, we'll do that. So when we think about implementing our adaptation framework, I think a couple of important things have been happening over at the state and local and regional level. I mentioned the implementation action plans for Safeguarding California. I think Louis mentioned earlier the technical advisory group that was also formed under Executive Order B3015, which also directed the implementation action plans. We are finalizing a guidance document for state agencies around how to plan under changing climate and what to be planning for, so what climate scenarios, but then also how do we embed a lot of our principles of resilient decision making into state planning and investment. And then we also have been integrating that work into sustainability roadmaps that every department develops. And so how is every department integrating climate change and starting to account for climate risk in that sustainability roadmap, just alongside all the other considerations around energy efficiency, water efficiency, renewable energy, zero-emission vehicles, adaptation and resilience is another element of that, just like the others. At the local and regional level, over the last several years, OPR has been leading a comprehensive update to the general plan guidelines, which were last updated in 2003. And we will have a final version of that document out later on in the next, I'll say April. And for folks who have been following that process, it's been a really in-depth process looking at how do we integrate climate change into the general planning process across elements, but then also specifically in the safety element, which is directed by state law. In that update, we've also been looking at embedding environmental justice and equity, economic development throughout that document. I know many people in the room have been engaged in that over the last few years. We also have an adaptation planning guide for local governments. Senate Bill 246, which created ICARP, also directed for an update to be made to this adaptation planning guide. The California Office of Emergency Services and the Natural Resources Agency produced that document in the past, and so they will be leading, OES will be leading the update to that document in the coming year. Then I also wanted to make a mention of some of the AmeriCorps programs that have been developed through the state, through the Governor's Initiative, specifically Civic Spark, which has been putting AmeriCorps members into local governments to help support climate change planning, both adaptation and mitigation. And so those are just some steps where we've really been trying to implement over the coming year, over the last year, several years, a lot of these activities. So when we think about where ICARP sits, it really spans a lot of these efforts. And so how do we link across state activities and local and regional activities? And so this group and the makeup of this group is really to help us think across scales. How do we make it, identify key points of coordination, to get back to that word, but sort of where are sort of key leverage points where working across state, local, and regional efforts can help to sort of unstick us and get us to be moving to implement things more on the ground. And then next on the clearinghouse, I also see, if you want to go to the next slide, as another bridging opportunity, which is how do we bridge across these activities with our research and tool development. And so I really view what the work that's happening through ICARP as ways that we start linking across these activities. And while it is really embedded at OPR and thinking about supporting local and regional action, the key to that is going to be how we make the connections across what's happening at the state level. And this is, I think, again, is intended not to be the state saying this is what you're going to do, but really this back and forth. And how do we think about, make it easier for things to happen at the local level, to learn from what's happening at local level, to identify what are the key things the state needs to do to help things to happen at a statewide scale or at a local or regional scale. So next, the final slide. Just in terms of our opportunities and goals, I guess this actually aligns with what Ken said. I left out medium term, but we'll say it's there. Really, it's what I think as a group, we have an opportunity to define what success would look like. What do we want our group, this council, to accomplish over the near and long term? And what does that mean for the different members of the council? And again, to really make this a two-way street. So this is a back and forth. We have state agencies here, local governments, and really it's a multi-way street. We also have non-governmental organizations, so we can really think about how to hear from one another and what are the opportunities to work together to get things unstuck and happening on the ground. And so identifying some of those key points of connections, both the barriers and the opportunities. And then again, finally, just to provide a venue for this engagement to happen. This is a public process, so the hope is this also is a way to open up the conversation to broader interest and engagement, and if we have the right vision, hopefully, as Bruce said, we'll get people to want to work with us because we do have this broad representation. And like I said, we do want the council to meet in other areas, not to always be in Sacramento, and how do we view that as another opportunity to, if we were to go to another region, to hear about a neat project or tour a neat project that is happening on the ground, or get them to come to that group and use this as that public venue to help further that action. And so I'm hoping that that will help spark some ideas for thinking about our work plan going forward, along with the conversation we've had already. But I'm happy to answer questions or open it up for discussion if folks have additional thoughts, and especially from Kaylee and others who are leading up. I don't want to put you on the spot, sorry, but other state colleagues who are leading up some of these safeguarding efforts, and we'll hear from more this afternoon. Mike.
I'm curious if there's any sort of concrete outcomes, successes that you would lay at the feet of all those great plans you shared that have been created over the last 2 years. Have any of them turned into a concrete success somewhere in the state that kind of can help me sort out what the path from planning to execution looks like?
Yes, I think we do have some nice examples, probably some more deliberate than others that were just nice, happy coincidence. I think, and I would look to my colleague Maureen Frank from Tuolumne County, I think we have a nice success that's happening in Tuolumne County where we've gotten some coordination, and we secured a large grant from HUD to support recovery from the rim fire. That was a state, local, and federal partnership actually to do that. But I think we also have a number of smaller successes, and those are a number of things, and I would actually also look to some of my colleagues from OPR that we have been trying to document and use for the clearinghouse. I think we have specific examples coming out of Civic Spark, which we've been working with Civic Spark members to document. So some I think are small and some are big, but I do think we're starting to see more of those successes and where we're starting to see plans turn into actions, even if the action is what is needed. And I think we'll hear about some of those this afternoon, but yeah.
To build off that question, I thought you were asking a different question, raised one in my mind. Given all of this great work, and also building off what Louis said earlier, to take advantage of what we've already done, to the extent that there are any kind of definitions of success that have been developed for any of these products that we could react to as part of our ongoing conversation about what we want to set as goals for this committee, that could be nice, initial starting place for us to build off of.
Mm-hmm.
So that question about how do we define success is something that we're, grappling with the safeguarding plan. I think it also ties right to the question of how do you look at these programs. There's kind of this siloed look of who the audiences are that we're creating these work products for, and at the state level, it's really the programs that are implementing the programs that we're making recommendations for. But then there's this larger unsiloed need to do kind of an unsiloed packaging of what we're doing as a larger adaptation effort. So, when we look in the safeguarding plan at what successes or what are the metrics that we're going to measure going forward, it's really, how do these programs implement how do they implement the programs to meet these larger goals? And I think, I guess the point is, I think we have to balance in between the siloed and the unsiloed when we talk about these, because there are clear audiences that sit around tables and only work on certain issues, and we want to develop products that they can take and then march forward with and do what they do best. But then we also don't want to lose sight of packaging this all into something bigger that can be more easily digestible at the public level, because we kind of just get stuck in our silos, and which is meaningful, but we also need to kind of connect it to something bigger.
Correct response. So that's great, and understand that more directly from my experience in the federal government when I was at USAID, and we were trying to come up with definitions for what our definition of success was for building resilience and across all the different sectors and all the different ways you can think about climate resilience. And one of the way that USAID, when I was there, was measuring kind of agency-wide what we were doing on resilience. Is we ended up doing a number of stakeholders, communities, or other affected groups with increased resilience. And that sounds a little squishy maybe, but it is intentionally that way so that you could take any sector that you were working in and develop a more specific definition of what that meant for resilience, and how you would quantify a stakeholder or community member, et cetera, becoming more resilient. But then you still could have that agency-wide metric that you could roll up across all the different activities that were going on in the climate resilient space and really start to track change over time. So, in the aspirational goal kind of conversation, maybe that's just some additional information we could consider looking at how other agencies, other governments, et cetera, have tried to address that issue.
Yeah, and this is all super interesting to me as a local government practitioner, and all of it's, I think, extremely relevant, but I do think that siloization has to occur among a much more broad conversation between even the private sector, so the development community. So for those of us that work at the granular level, we find value in breaking those silos between our government partners and our nonprofits and those with subject matter expertise. But when the rubber meets the road and we are all looking at this on a daily basis and applying it on a daily basis, I think there's got to be some broader conversations at that ground level to engage those that we may not have wanted or thought to engage before, simply because it makes the vernacular much more known through all the communities that we deal with on a daily basis. So from my perspective, I want to see something coming out of this in terms of deliverables. Yes, case studies and successes are all great, but I also think there's got to be a basic toolbox that I can take back to our local communities that we can say, these types of terms have to be more of our conversations on a daily basis. And what does that mean? And what kind of help can we gain from our partners around this table, for example, to come to our local communities and help us engage with those communities that may not normally be at the table. So that's kind of the thing I'm looking for, is a very broad toolbox that has things from the general to the very specific, that I not only can educate folks in my organization, but those that we work with on a daily basis that are not even in government or not in nonprofits or not really at the table normally.
I guess I'd add kind of two things. It seems like we almost have to stop being maladaptive, and that doesn't turn into a really sexy mission statement, right? But it almost feels like, I don't know if it exists already, but do we have an inventory of the things that we do because they're just set on autopilot and they're actually taking us the wrong direction? And that might be a really useful list to make. And then the other piece is that in many cases we're going to need pretty large institutional changes, and those don't happen if we don't do them on purpose. So just setting the conditions for success, and then the enlightened crowd recognizes, oh, got it. But if you don't make intentional interventions in the way that the institutions are designed, and that's budget lines and authority and staffing, it's all sorts of boring background stuff, but if you don't do that piece, you don't get the shifts that you need. So it seems like maybe in that toolbox that you're talking about, it needs to be, how do you go back and look carefully through the list of things you're doing on autopilot and then reposition yourself to change them all. And again, that's really in the weeds and kind of dull, but maybe that's the place that needs the most work.
This is great. I think a lot of what I'm going to say is underscoring some points that are already made, but I think that kind of doing the legwork up front to be really inclusive in how we're kind of setting goals and vision and defining things, and looking to some of the stakeholder groups that are not commonly in this conversation or have a seat at the table, I think helps to just set us on a track that is more sustainable, that we really have a broader group buying in to what we're trying to accomplish. And ideally, we're really targeting, prioritizing those groups that are going to get hit first and worst by climate change. And so just kind of underscoring, I think, the long-term value of being very inclusive in the beginning. And Lisa, you mentioned the possibility of going into different areas of the state with our meetings and to reaching different stakeholder groups and communities. I think that would be phenomenal. I think that'd be really, I think it's really critical and it's important. And so as part of that kind of goal of being more inclusive, I think that would be a great way to do that. And then the other thing is just being, I feel like we can be really bold. This is, you know, a great group of experts. We're not like a super highly visible political body at this point. You know, might as well just kind of go out there and be really bold with our vision and goals. And if we could do that with a pretty wide stakeholder group involved and engaged, I think that we could be really effective.
Other comments? Comments from the public? So, okay, so with that, I think we will go ahead. So it is perfect, 10 minutes to 12. I think we'll break now, and that should give everyone a chance to get out, get some lunch before the crowds hit. And then we'll start back up here again with Senator Wojciechowski at 1 o'clock, and then dive in. I think this morning has been really great to dive in on some topics to help us think through how we can move some of this forward. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Mike.
Hi, Mike. Gloria.
Nice to meet you.
Nice meeting you.
I sound like I'm sick, but I'm actually not sick anymore, so don't worry.
Sorry. We have a limited budget. And we're not allowed to do food. That's right.
The doctor said
but there are places both here
Yeah, okay, great.
I was kind of looking it down here. This morning. I bet, yeah. I came in
we have a specific program. We work on strides and help.
We've just gotten into
How are you?
How are things with you? One of the comments that I'll make later.
I'm the program manager.
and leveraging I'm not in a while. You know how long I think that we never really, you know, especially the local people. Yeah, we got we are maximizing the leverage. We've got our big program coverage and stuff. So, are you ready to try something in Northern California?
Yeah, we I don't know exactly. It's called the Tribal Circuit Running Program.
Right. Absolutely.
Project. Figure out the funding sources and negotiate with engineers. Maybe as you pursue the project, there's a way to implement it.
We're waiting for sort of an initial maybe funding opportunity for it to happen, and it's not critical for us because we have, you know, like I said, we don't have it, but we have it, and so it's not a top priority for us, but it is definitely toward the top of the list. Right down.
Yeah, and I'm not the one who works on that side of the house, but we have a loan fund with it.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Low interest loans. You mentioned some members are well.
Right.
Particularly with the drought, we need to drill deeper and well.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I was excited about this group is the focus on on the energy side, there's that national policy desire and IRE, clearinghouse mandate for energy projects, basically, and like utility incentives, anything that's publicly available is on there. So it's very easy to or relatively easy to search. Yeah, it is great for comprehensive argument, right? It seems like, and I don't know if this is already developed. It might already be developed under CalAdapt or but one of the things I could see us doing that group is maybe through case study discussions, right? Come up with a desire-like funding clearinghouse for adaptation measures that fair motivation, right? And I think that from our perspective, it's such an easy way to tie in private and marketplace, right? So it would be kind of super easy to do that through that. We've had a lot of good luck on even on our grant funded projects to have private technology partners match, to hundreds of thousands, and not just small amounts, right? Like lots of money. And so it could be that we could do that.
That would be add to the toolbox.
Yeah, exactly. And so do you basically have like a revolving loan kind of fund?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a community development financial.
Yeah. CDFI. We looked at that. We looked at developing one of those. Small, we don't have. Really have a
there are there's an organization now. We're like associated.
So back when I was following this a few years ago, the CDFI program, there was often grants that came out to provide new lending portfolios and capital. Is that still a pretty robust thing, or is it in jeopardy? Or
well, it's in jeopardy, but the application is out right now for the open.
Yeah.
So they have an open note out right now. It was on the Heritage Foundation's list of 0 out. It's pretty quickly now.
Knows that I'm serious. Well, I mean, that is that part of the yeah, where you have these CDFIs that you have
and when, Tara, when do we reconvene?
Right.
It's not like Build America Bond or something that's going to take like 5 years to
Right.
get executed.
Well, CDFIs come in the best to fill gaps.
A little closer on 10. So there's like a sandwich burger place, and there's veggie burgers there too. And then, yeah, Labu is like a little, that
Are such a patchwork of things. You might have 10 grants, or you might have, something that you're starting with, but then you need that.
but on 10th, there's a few places.
Yeah, thank you so much.
No, all of you have been in the game for a long time, so you realize how important it was for the governor to sign SB 246, and I'll take advantage of this rare occasion to address you and start or kick off the first TAC meeting. So this is part of the climate adaptation puzzle, and part of the solution are you folks. The technical advisors they're going to sit together, come up with some pieces. My background's a bankruptcy attorney, so I talk to folks about Chapter 11s, and even with the municipalities, Chapter 9s, is that you have to work on little pieces, and it may not work for everybody, but you can have the piece stand alone, and then we can export it, hopefully, to other places that are working. So thank you for allowing me to speak. I want to thank the Office of Planning and Research for recruiting such a fantastic group of people, the Magnificent 17, as we're calling them, and the diversity that you reflect intellectually and geographically being here. This is, we had a little bit of background, you probably know about it, but in 2015, my committee in the Senate on Environmental Quality had 4 regional hearings and got to visit Oakland, Merced. That was a first for me at the University of Merced, and Los Angeles, and talk with department heads and advocates in each of the different regions, tried to focus on different elements of an adaptation strategy. And also hearing from the private sector and the nonprofit sector was very important. We hear from government leaders all the time because we're, state senators, and government people always come to us. But but that aha moment when we learned about what the state was doing and the CAT with the resource agency, but how the communication between the local and regional folks wasn't working. So this idea of having collaboration and sharing the best practices and the latest scientific data all of a sudden rose to the top of what we were trying to do and your birth today. So we understand the clearinghouse. I understand the website is a little bit clunky about information that's going to be there, but it's really this ongoing technical advisory board or council that we have, which is makes me very, very excited, and I want to congratulate each and every one of you. Local workers with responsibilities over adaptation issues want good, trusted sources to turn to when issues arise in their community. Having the council in place will enable them to act more quickly on scientific information and better understand some of the challenges involved with building resiliency. I'm a big adaptation proponent, and in California, we obviously, even more obviously after November 9th, have a role to play as the global leader in creating these policy frameworks to reduce greenhouse gases and allow us to fashion policies that will allow us to meet the changing climate situation and also those goals that we want to stay here. In other forums, I've said to folks that we can't save everything. You know, we're not, the idea is that some of our built community has been in areas that, you want to go like this, what were we doing there when we thought about it? And part of my job is, after I get the technical information from you folks, is to tell that sad story, to tell the story that there has to be choices that we're going to make as we build or maintain the community we have. Obviously, nobody's going to, well, maybe somebody will, but you don't want to fight over the San Francisco and Oakland airports. I mean, we think that those are pretty big investments, in LA airport for that matter. But some of the other effects are going to hit regions where we're going to have to make real tough decisions and say, that's really, that floodplain, and that's an area that can't continue to exist with the way that we've built it out. You know, severe weather systems, 5 years of drought, flooding, longer wildfires, heat waves. I like that Linda Ronstadt song, so I always want to know about which of you is a specialist on heat waves, right? Taking the mantle over from Linda. And one of the vector-borne diseases, that was a very big surprise for me when I got down to LA at our field hearing and learning about the effect. And the same thing with the air conditioning and the heat, realizing that the area that's the most vulnerable is probably San Francisco, because they've got 150 years or 170 years of never having air conditioning. You know, none of the buildings that are there, whatever, if there are still people of modest means in San Francisco, that's a question. Nobody builds a place with air conditioning there. So, you know, I represent parts of two counties, so Southern Alameda County and Alameda County. In Alameda County, just in June, passed the regional measure AA, which hopes to address sea level rise and have a clean and healthy bay. So through a $12 parcel tax, we're going to invest $500 million over the next 20 years on how to protect our shoreline and our future generations. Again, that's seems like a lot of money, but it's not all that much money when you look at some of the infrastructure that's there. But the level of adaptation investment throughout California is, and even in the Bay Area, is hit and miss. You know, one grand jury report came to my attention was criticizing a city in my district, Milpitas, for not even incorporating sea level rise into any of its planning concerns. If you can believe that, in 2017, that might be, you know, but it illustrates how some areas have given this more thought than others, and this is in California. So your work will become even more important for those communities that are slow to react. And if we have that in the Bay Area, one can imagine how we have it in other parts of the state. Looking forward, I hope we can expand the scientific research that the Council undertakes, possibly by partnering with our public higher education systems as issues come up around agricultural production, public health impacts, effects on wildlife are better understood. I would be remiss if I didn't joke with myself and anticipating that every one of you is thinking, hey, Wachowski, show me the money. Where is the money to do the work that we have? And I'm mindful of that. I do share the budget subcommittee that has natural resources and energy and transportation. So I am quietly and diligently looking for ways to crochet bits of money together so that we can have partnerships on the scientific and the planning side. I know the governor, the Office of Planning and Research, and our legislative leaders are all behind you. And we in California, not like the Chinese, take climate change for real. And we understand, regardless of what happens in Washington, D.C., I want all of you to know that our state's going to move ahead. And I think each one of you individually and collectively are going to play an important role in helping California and the world meet their climate change. Congratulations. You guys are all smarty pants, and I'm really delighted to be here, and I wish you the best of luck in I was mentioning before, we have a regional Western States Council, and I'm the chairman of the Energy and Environment section for the next 2 years. And that's wonderful. There hasn't been a California there for a while. Just so you know, these are get the Western states: Wyoming, Utah, Idaho, New Mexico, Colorado. So we're going to be doing spending this summer working on the regional grid and what the benefits and shortfallings are that. But we're going to be having a webinar on climate change, and so you guys will have this meeting. You'll have the June meeting before we get together. But I'll try to pull together some presentation for the Western states. And as my press person said, even if they don't believe in climate change and they don't want to, they call it what you want to. But here are some tools as we plan for the future. So get to work. Congratulations once again, and thank you for letting me address you.
Thank you, Senator Wieckowski.
Welcome aboard.
Thanks again for coming.
Go back around. Did he get you first? All right. And there's
There you go.
Great. Thank you all. Great. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for returning from lunch. I guess that bodes well for the morning. So what we're going to do this afternoon is to go through sort of elements of a work plan. And these are, the intention here is not to decide on, we have sort of 3 items that we're going to talk about. 2 state-led efforts around some planning updates that are issues that naturally span state, local, and regional activities. One is on the general plan guidelines update, which clearly work from OPR that is directly interfaces with local governments. Another is on the update that is underway to the state sea level rise guidance, which is for state agencies, but now also for local governments as well. So we'll talk about both of those, and then we're going to hear also from some results, interim results from a project being led by the Local Government Commission in partnership with others through the 4th Climate Assessment, looking at financing challenges. So these are just sort of 3 different topics that we thought would be helpful to sort of stir people's imaginations about how the TAC could, should, or shouldn't engage on the kinds of issues that we have in front of us. And these we thought were 3 nice concrete examples. This is not the only opportunity we have to discuss a work plan. Like I said, we could do this meeting by meeting, or we can all decide that we want to have a work plan for 12 months. And that will be part of our discussion. But just know this is not, these are not the only options. These are more meant to be inspirational. And that there are more to throw into the mix. I think even coming out of this morning, we have some things we can throw into the mix as well. And so we don't have to take action on any or all of this, but the hope is to come out with some sense of direction at a very minimum of what we want to do when we get back together in June. And so what is the task that we would want to tackle at that next meeting? And so I guess with that, did I hit on all of our key? I will go ahead and turn it over to talk for the first presentation. And with each presentation, we have a presenter and then some discussion questions. We've sort of allotted roughly about 20 minutes per topic so that we have remaining time for general discussion, that we can talk across them. So we'll have plenty of time to have some discussion this afternoon. So the first presentation is going to be Michael McCormick, from a senior planner at OPR, to talk about the general plan guidelines and the 2017 update that is just been completed and is on its way to being a public document soon.
Great, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. So excited to see all of you. Some new faces, which is fantastic for these conversations. Michael McCormick from OPR. And as many of you know, the Office of Planning and Research, we're the state statutory planning agency. We have a number of statutory obligations that we have to meet to support that, that sort of determination of who we are. One of them is the general plan guidelines, so supporting the development of local government general plans throughout the state, basically taking the statute, but also encapsulating that statute and recommendations to fit existing practice and, in the new version, emerging practice or best practice as well. So there's this minimum statutory obligations and then where we'd like people to go, and we provide guidance to help them get there. We also lead up the California Environmental Quality Act guidelines and a number of other things as well. So local government land use is something that we see as a really critical part of our mission, and the general plan guidelines in the process of being updated for the past 5 years, as Louise mentioned earlier, has been a really deep engagement activity, not only internally within the state, but also with our external partners at the local and regional scale, as we've tried to identify where did the 2003 guidelines, what did they do right, what did they not do right, where are the gaps, and updates to respond to new laws and requirements. So I'm going to go through relatively quickly some of the new requirements that are specific to this group. There's a lot of others that overlap with adaptation. Adaptation touches everything. So I would encourage you to also think outside the box beyond just what I'm presenting here, and happy to respond to any questions or conversation as we go through that a few minutes after this too. So general plan is like a local government constitution. Guides their development, guides how they do, how they go through the lives of the jurisdiction. It's a blueprint for the community's vision of future growth. Most general plans start with a community vision and then build from that through community engagement, stakeholder groups. Looks backwards to identify what's gone well within the community, what needs to change to reflect the direction that community wants to go in the future, or in some cases the direction the community is going versus the direction people may want to see it go, which is a deeper conversation. Examining current data and emerging trends. So the data aspect of general plans has become more critical as more data has become available. And really the disclosure component of general plans and general plan environmental impact reports to meet the CEQA requirements. That's a really big part of how general plans are created now. That really wasn't the case in 2003 when the last general plan guidelines were updated. And then of course considering future issues, challenges, and goals. And thinking about how to move forward. There's been quite a few pieces of legislation. This doesn't capture it all. I'm going to focus on the top two, SB 1000, which includes environmental justice, and SB 379 on climate change adaptation. But SB 375 around regional planning, new flood management requirements, new CEQA requirements about vehicle miles traveled versus level of service, basically changing the metric and how we think about transportation impacts on the environment. SB 244, island and fringe communities, thinking how we bring folks into the fold that are currently underserved communities, new tribal consultation requirements, and then AB 2140, which is the hope is that this will help connect local hazard mitigation plans more significantly with general plans. Another piece of this is to respond to the need for better data. We've talked to quite a few consultants in the field and local governments where they really struggle to find authoritative base data to support the development of their general plans. So we've developed a general plan data tool. It'll be up and running with the updated data by the time the general plan guidelines are released in April. And it really is intended to link local governments to the core data they need to do the required elements of a general plan. And for any of you that have been involved in a general plan process, the data collection effort in and of itself can take a very long time and cost a fair amount of money with both consultants and staff time. And so we'll be able to provide a number of different ways to download this data. General plans have a set of required elements. but we've also included a number of new chapters to help provide context and support what we heard when we went out and did 24 workshops all around the state, what we heard local governments needed to do a better job at their in-house and their general plan work. So the required elements include land use, circulation, housing, conservation, open space, and noise. And the safety element, which I'll be talking about a little bit here, environmental justice. It can either be an element that is standalone, or you can incorporate environmental justice throughout a general plan. I'll talk about that in just a second. That's a new requirement. And then air quality, which has before only been required in the San Joaquin Valley. There's been a number of jurisdictions that have decided to do an optional air quality element because they see it as a priority for them. But now, through the SB 1000 environmental justice requirements, we're also seeing that disadvantaged communities are now required to do air quality analysis as well. There's new chapters on public engagement. One of the weaknesses we've heard from many of our local partners is that that public engagement piece has been pretty weak. The statutory obligation is really only for 2 public workshops, but if you're doing a multi-year general plan effort, I think we all might acknowledge that that's not fully adequate, even though it's all that's minimally required. So we provide some support to do better engagement. There's a much deeper discussion on healthy and resilient communities. Climate change. So there's both the greenhouse gas emission side of climate change and the adaptation side that are addressed in the general plan. The emission side lays out an approach to be consistent with CEQA requirements. Because what we've seen is climate action plans being done at the local level to augment general plans or create a bridge between general plans and general plan environmental impact reports. And so we provide a methodology to accommodate that. Economic development, this has been a really big issue that we heard about consistently. And then social equity and resilience as well. So on the environmental justice side, SB 1000 requires environmental justice be addressed in general plans that are identified as disadvantaged communities. So there's a number of different identifiers for how you get to that objective. We don't, out of the 8,000 census tracts within the state that might be determined to be a disadvantaged community, we don't have a full understanding of every single one that might be, but if you have a census tract that's disadvantaged within the community, if you're doing a general plan, you also need to do an environmental justice element or incorporate environmental justice throughout the document. It does require community engagement. It's not specific, but again, this links back to that outreach piece. We try to provide support to make it easy to do that outreach and engagement, and really looking for the purpose of building long-term relationships with your constituents that might fall into that disadvantaged community category. In environmental justice communities, like I mentioned, air quality analysis must be completed, but there's a very strong linkage to adaptation and resilient communities. The adaptation piece that's required by SB 379 is statutorily mandated process to address adaptation. But when we talk about resilient communities, it's a much softer definition, and it can change dramatically between communities. What do you mean by a resilient community? And it goes far beyond climate. It goes to how a community can address issues that they may be facing that another community isn't. But we dig into a little bit more detail in the general plans on that. The safety element, a really critical piece, SB 379, puts the safety element as the home for climate adaptation. Although I can tell you, prior to 379, we had incorporated adaptation in pretty much every element of the general plan, and it's still there as an information item to tie together the theme, to make sure people are thinking about adaptation as something that's not just standalone on the side in one element, but it's really something that we're thinking about throughout the planning process, throughout the document. So even if you're updating one element, you also have to be thinking about adaptation. So flood, fire, earthquakes, there's a number of other hazards that you're required to look at. And I mentioned earlier the encouragement of connecting local hazard mitigation plans to safety elements. And I think one of the things that we found as we were out talking with planners is the planners oftentimes don't know their emergency management partners within their own jurisdiction, silos of excellence, as we like to call. And And really, one of the interesting side effects of requiring adaptation be addressed in your general plan is you can't really avoid talking with your hazard manager as you go through that process. So we provide guidance, and we're working with the Office of Emergency Services to better support the interconnection between hazard managers and planners so that we can all be talking the same language, because it really is a different language. Climate change adaptation, it may now be required in safety elements, but again, it does not preclude incorporation into the other areas throughout the general plan. The cross-linkages and co-benefits piece is a really critical one, and we've provided some examples of those co-benefits and cross-linkages, but I think we're going to have some unexpected occurrences as this rolls out, and hopefully we'll be able to identify other valuable things that we can highlight and support. And you go through a really distinct process for planning. You assess your community's vulnerability. Well, you first look at your existing planning framework, identify what may or may not meet SB 379 criteria, and then you assess your community's vulnerability, you set goals, policies, and objectives, and then you implement, which is, part of your role, I imagine, and selfishly as someone working on the general plan guidelines, hopefully you can help us identify how some of the implementation can occur more efficiently and more effectively. So the process in brief is using CalAdapt to do a vulnerability assessment, and then going through the 9-step process in the adaptation planning guide to look at your vulnerabilities, your hazard mitigation measures that address adaptation, and then evaluating and prioritizing those based on community needs and implementing them. And one of the really valuable components of SB 246, the work you're doing is the TAC, but also the clearinghouse, is it provides a home for innovation and case studies to show how this process might work, how this process could be amended through real-world case studies. And so those are some of the things that we're trying to do as a part of the clearinghouse, is identify case studies where people have met the entire process for 379. Again, there's a strong focus on data, and locally available data that isn't currently in state data sets is something that we're going to try to help folks connect with, but there's also going to need to be some creative discussions on how best to roll the data up into the analysis and how to roll it out through the policy and implementation. The next steps for the general plan guidelines, release in April. We're going to have dozens of workshops in the next 2 years. It is meant to be a living document, so we do plan on updating it to respond to what we hear in the field, and not too frequently though. Perhaps this first update will occur within a year-plus time span, and regular occurrences in the future we would hope to take place on every 2 years or so, or as needed. The case study support is going to continue from the general plan side, but we are linking closely with the clearinghouse work. And I think that just like the Safeguarding California plan served as a place for state agencies to encapsulate policies on adaptation, we're also seeing the general plan guidelines as a place to encapsulate process and guidance on adaptation as well. And so you as the Technical Advisory Council could potentially play a role in linking the state, regional, local initiatives here. So got to this slide. I'm not sure protocol, but are we going to open it up to discussion?
Yeah, I think if people have questions and discussion, so then yeah, we can just have some conversation, and then we can go. Then I think we'll probably want to link across them too as we move forward. But yeah, there are questions. Mike, you can ask questions, or you can answer those questions. So either one. Yeah.
I know you're right behind me, Michael. Sorry. How do general plans think about other plans? And in my water world, things like urban water management plan, integrated regional water management plans, water quality basin plans, there's tons of water plans out there. Are general plans encouraged in any way to try to intake what other people are thinking about?
Yeah, more than just encouraged. In many cases, they're required. General plans are a place to roll up all of the regional and local plans that are applicable to the jurisdiction into one place so that they know everything that's going on and they can interconnect that through the elements in the general plan. So that's the intent. It doesn't always work that way, but the hope is that with the additional guidance we've provided on interlinking those plans, that'll happen a little bit more efficiently.
Michael, this looks like a great orderly plan. What's going to make it work? And what do you see are maybe the problems, just to be negative, that you see arising that's going to keep it from working?
Well, I think there was a few things that we heard when we were doing outreach that are going to continue to be problems that have always been problems. There's technical expertise, which requires oftentimes hiring an external consultant. Then that's directly related to the other problem, which is financial. The funding able to support the update timelines. Housing elements are required to be updated every 5 to 8 years. Safety elements are required to be updated every time your local hazard mitigation plan is updated. Environmental justice discussions are required to be updated anytime there's 2 or more elements of your general plan to be updated. So oftentimes when a housing element is updated, the safety element is also updated, which automatically spurs the update to the environmental justice discussions, and then you have this cascading effect through all the other elements in a general plan. So just the cost of updating a general plan on a regular basis can be restrictive to local governments. And having worked at the local government level in the past, the day-to-day management of emergencies oftentimes gets in the way of long-range planning. So if we can continue to provide additional support to our local partners on both capacity and funding, that's certainly a help. And a lot of what we heard was, for example, the Prop 84 funds that came out of the Strategic Growth Council a few years back and are continuing to roll down and wrap up. Those were very helpful to incorporate the climate elements into general plans and climate action plans. The federal stimulus, for example, provided funding to do dozens of climate action plans in the state. So really trying to frame up opportunities so that communities can take advantage of those opportunities when they become available so that they're not constantly struggling to catch up with the minimum requirements.
Oh, Brian.
Just a quick question, maybe a follow-up. Do the same rules apply to charter cities as general law cities?
No, and that's an important distinction. General law cities really are the only ones that are mandated to comply with minimum statute in the general plan guidelines. I mean, we find that charter cities typically do comply because it sets a recipe book for how to do good local planning. But there's often deviations, and by law, that's okay.
Right, and just as a follow-up on that, as a charter city that's very reluctant, I think, to adjust our general plan. I mean, the amount of political will it takes to do a general plan is also, I think, a big barrier to doing that type of work. And then have you guys, I think a lot of jurisdictions are moving towards specific plans as a way to sort of get around that, and I don't know if was there any thought around adjusting some of the specific plan requirements?
We didn't actually go through the process of adjusting any of the specific plan discussions. I think we acknowledge that they are being used more and more because oftentimes they're less expensive or they're developer funded, right. Which tends to take the lift off of the local government that's trying to update the general plan. But the problem is the specific plan is very specific. Yeah. And if you want this holistic view of your community, the general plan is really the place for that discussion. And so I think at least from what we heard, there are some communities that are struggling with having so many specific plans that are inconsistent with the base general plan that consistency discussion is becoming an issue they're going to need to deal with. Yep.
Thank you, Luis. For those of us who are not as familiar with general plans, can you define general law city versus charter city?
Right, so a general law city is one that is, I just drew a blank on the definitions. Brian, maybe you can rescue me on the definition of charter city, and then I'll move forward with the general law.
Yeah, this takes me back many years, but I think that I mean, general city. I thought there was a specific date potentially in the statute or something. It was a city that was incorporated after, and I want to say it's sometime in the 1950s or something, where they are required to follow the state's general guidelines. Whereas if you're a charter city, typically incorporated before that, whatever that date is. Some of the older and larger cities like Los Angeles, Sacramento, I think Vallejo, San Francisco, Sacramento, those cities are not required to follow the same general plan rules and regulations. Doesn't mean that they don't have general plans, or they don't try to follow the guidance like Mike was mentioning.
Yeah, and they could either choose to become a general law city or stay a charter city. So many jurisdictions at that time chose to become a general law city, just because there's a very straightforward way to go through compliance. It's standardized, whereas charter cities have to really develop their own policies in-house.
Thanks, Michael. So as somebody who has been sort of engaged in the guidelines update, I do have a couple of clarifying questions. First of all, this April date that's a rollout is, when does it become effective? When are cities compelled, for my general law city friends out there, when are they compelled to abide by the guidelines, or should they?
There isn't a firm compliance date, but generally we would expect local governments that are starting to scope their general plan after the release of the general plan guidelines, that they would meet the standards within the general plan guidelines.
Okay.
That being said, all the statute that's in the general plan guidelines, the guidelines aren't released yet, but the statute's already there. Okay. So those requirements are already in place. The only thing that's missing is the guidance that goes along with them. So those timelines are lined up at different time frames.
And then a follow-up, what do the guidelines opine relative to the sustainable community strategies around the state and climate action plans within the local jurisdictions?
Yes, so SB 375 explicitly does not require a local government to implement regional strategies that apply to them. But we do encourage that, because it just makes for more orderly growth. And obviously there's transportation funding that is associated with implementing those policies. So we do talk about that in a number of different elements: land use, circulation, and in the climate change section. When it comes to climate action plans, there's a lot of different ways to look at climate change. People have had climate action plans, climate action and adaptation plans, climate adaptation plans. They've incorporated throughout the general plan. They've incorporated just the emissions piece in the environmental impact report, but not in the general plan. A lot of different ways to do it. So what we framed up is that that's okay, as long as you follow a specific process that's captured in the California Environmental Quality Act. So there's the 6-step process that's outlined there. And so that's reflected in the general plan guidelines as a recommended approach. But we've also had a recent Supreme Court case that said it's good to do a climate action plan. That's an okay way to go. And we're seeing those climate action plans being used, and adaptation plans, as a bridge between the general plan and the environmental impact report. And it makes it easier to update that climate action plan to respond to trends without having to open up the whole general plan.
I was curious to know, CalAdapt has a lot of very good data visualization and providing in a regional context. I was wondering, is there any effort on translating this data into more of a decision support system?
We've had this discussion a number of times. There is a discussion happening, and it's been going on for a couple of years now, regarding the connection between CalAdapt and the Adaptation Planning Guide, and potentially having this online decision support tool that reflects the process in the Adaptation Planning Guide, so that you can actually have a decision support process based on the output of CalAdapt, which looks at your vulnerability. That's the ideal scenario. I think there's been some logistical and funding challenges in making that happen. But that's, I think, certainly on the table for the discussion moving forward.
Thank you, Michael. So I know that SB 379 has some provisions around the hazard mitigation plan, and maybe a question for you and or for Tina. To what degree does how does this work from the general plan intersect with the hazard mitigation planning process, and what's the experience so far?
Well, I can start, and if Tina wants to add anything, she can. So since 379 passed, we've been working with OES on the Office of Emergency Services to coordinate between the general plan guidelines and local hazard mitigation plans, because 379 really does create a stronger linkage. And there's an existing allowance via AB 2140 that incentivizes local hazard mitigation plans being incorporated into general plan safety elements. And you know, through that, I think that we're seeing a stronger connection between the emergency management landscape and the planning landscape. And with 379 itself, it really only requires changes to the safety element of a general plan, but there's unintended consequences of that has a ripple effect through other policy documents. So OES is looking at how 379 affects their work, as are some other state agencies like the Coastal Commission, which weren't directly named as entities that need to change their policy, but through this and the changes to general plans and local requirements, they may also be having to look at some changes as well. Tina, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I guess this probably makes it more confusing, but the local hazard mitigation plans are voluntary. A lot of people have done them because it's the gateway to get money from the feds for post-disaster hazard mitigation work. But you know, we try to at least have them done at the county level as a minimum. So, so I think having it kind of both included not only creates a linkage that should be there anyway, but also knowing that you know, these are all essentially voluntary activities, and we wanted to incentivize those and make that as sensible as possible for those that choose to do that, link the two. Now it's law as of, I think, January 1 that if you're going to opt to do a local hazard mitigation plan, it needs to incorporate climate. We had already done that for the plans that we fund, had made that a requirement. So now this just expands it to the ones that are regardless of how they're funded.
Yeah, I wanted to draw that out because we have worked with you on integrating climate considerations into those voluntary plans. And if you look at the Coastal Commission, who has sea level rise guidance that they're making available for updating, I guess, local coastal plans and maybe individual projects too, I'm not sure, but seems to be some nexus here between coastal planning, hazard mitigation planning, general planning, all around climate, and that intersection might be a place for the TAC to focus, in part because we could leverage these three processes.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful segue. So we have two more questions. I'm just mindful of time because our next presentation is going to be talking about the sea level rise guidance update, and I think will help. I know there's a lot of questions about the general plan guidelines too, but if we just have a couple of quick questions and then roll to the next one, and then I think also the financing, I think it may be more productive to have this broader conversation together rather across the three topics. I do think there's some crossover and can help us sort of tease out what role the TAC might play on these individual pieces or on the intersection, as you just suggested, Louis. So Jana, you want to?
Yeah, I think my question is directly related to maybe the second question on the screen. You know, one of the primary focuses of this group is to integrate climate actions or support activities to integrate climate actions that pair mitigation with adaptation. In the general plan guidance, is there discussion of that pairing?
Absolutely. Okay. I think more and more as we've, since B3015 was signed, that was the first executive order that acknowledged climate change is really two sides of the same coin. Before that, emissions and adaptation were typically separated, and the co-benefits discussion is something that has become quite prominent. And we also understand there's cost to doing both emissions and adaptation work and policy implementation. So if you're really focusing on those policies and programs that have dual benefit, that's really the sweet spot, maximizes efficiency, return on investment for taxpayers. There's a lot of different benefits for it. So we do have a narrative in there around that.
Danielle.
Unfortunately, I haven't jumped too much into the general plan guidelines discussion in the last few years, but I'm really curious, coming from the Central San Joaquin Valley, where groundwater, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act has really upended a lot of planning processes and sort of rendered a few cities' general plans almost irrelevant in the new sort of way that we manage water. And so I'm just curious how that law is being integrated into the guidelines, or if it already has, and how that's being taken into account in that process.
So SGMA is in the conservation element, but we also acknowledge water is a much bigger issue than simply as something that can be spattered throughout the general plan guidelines. So we're actually starting up a process to include an optional water element discussion and suggestions for how to incorporate that throughout the general plan guidelines. We just didn't have the capacity to do the significant work that that's going to require while we were updating the rest of the guidelines. So that's something to look forward to in the very near future.
Great questions.
Just really quick, I think this speaks to the second question that's posed up on the screen. Looking at this through the lens of regional planning and as a representative of MBO, we've got 190 cities in our region, and roughly 40% of them have not updated their general plan since AB 32 went into place 11 years ago. So it's a very daunting task. So I'm wondering if the guidelines have been, or maybe we as a group could come up with a template for cities that would look at this as an uphill battle, or what it would mean in terms of implementation, whether it's through specific plan guidelines or zoning regulations. What does that really mean for a city so that they don't just look the other way?
Right, and I think one of the biggest things that were called out as we've done outreach is people need to see examples of where it's been done before, and that's exactly where the clearinghouse comes in, is being able to provide real-world examples of how it's been done, the methodology they used, where possible, templates that are based on that case study, and then pros and cons of going through that process, where they got the funding from to do it, how it's working, how it's not, how it's affected state policy. So those case study write-ups are really one of the more valuable components of the guidelines. It's really, there's a relatively minor presence of case studies right now, but we're going to be building that out over the next year or two to hopefully be something that covers all the issues with a more of a focus on climate change. There are templates and examples within the guidelines itself that I think will provide you some help in having those discussions, and those local governments as well. I hopefully won't see it as daunting of a task, because we provide some tools and resources for them to go through that process in a more straightforward manner. But call me.
Martin.
Thank you, Michael. This is a related question as I reflect on the question. But in terms of who's providing education and technical assistance to these cities with regards to their general planning process, and what role does OPR have with those providers?
I thought ILG was doing that. Just kidding. So OPR, one of the things that we do is technical support. We have calls that come in regularly through the OPR clearinghouse, which is separate from the adaptation clearinghouse. A little confusing. But we get calls regularly about process to follow, interpretation of statute, how folks should move forward, or who else they should be talking with that might have gone through a similar process. And so we have a rotating call structure where we provide that technical support. Over the next couple of years, we're also planning on doing some really active outreach on the general plan guidelines. We acknowledge it's a little bit of a heavy lift. This is a full rewrite, and that hasn't been done since 2003. So there is going to be a little bit of a learning curve on everybody's part as these guidelines rolls out. And we fully acknowledge there's going to be some gaps, and or should I say opportunities, to work together to really help frame up some of those holes that might be identified. So we would look to organizations that are represented around the table and like ILG to help us with that and connect us to the right folks so that we're incorporating the feedback we need.
Thanks, Michael. I think that was helpful conversation. I think it would be great to hear from Jen Eckerly, who I think is over, on the sea level rise guidance update process, because it, well, touches on something that was mentioned here, but then is also another example of an important guidance process from the state, but is the primary consumers and users are both state agencies and local governments. And so I think maybe we'll raise some similar questions, but also some important cross pieces with the general plan guidelines.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Jen Eckerly. I'm the Deputy Director of the California Ocean Protection Council, and I'm going to briefly describe who we are, otherwise known as OPC, and our current effort to update the state sea level rise guidance document and how the TAC can potentially help engage state and local governments, and how you can also participate directly. So the Ocean Protection Council is a cabinet-level state policy body created in statute. We're nested within the California Natural Resources Agency, with our executive director also serving as the Deputy Secretary for Oceans and Coastal Policy. So we're essentially the ocean program of the Resources Agency. Our council is 7 members, including the Secretary of Natural Resources and Environmental Protection, the Chair of the State Lands Commission. We have a member of the Senate and the Assembly, and 2 public seats. Our mission is to ensure healthy, resilient, productive ocean and coastal ecosystems for current and future generations. And we achieve this mission in several ways. We help improve the coordination of state coastal management agencies. We help ensure the best available science is informing policy and management decisions. And we help identify state and federal changes in state or federal laws necessary to improve the protection of marine ecosystems offshore in California. We also have a grant-making arm to our work where we provide funds for projects that help advance research, monitoring, and restoration, and we leverage other funding sources across the state to help bolster ocean protection. Currently, our priority programs include climate change, marine protected areas, marine pollution, sustainable fisheries, and emerging uses such as offshore wind. So I'm going to speak a little bit, or mainly today, about our work around updating the state sea level rise guidance document. So OPC is in the process of updating the state sea level rise guidance document in collaboration with the Natural Resources Agency, OPR, and other state agency partners. Just a little bit of background, the original sea level rise guidance document was adopted in 2010 and updated in 2013 to incorporate the National Research Council's 2012 science, which was an analysis of sea level rise along the West Coast. The current guidance was developed to help guide state agencies in their permitting, planning, and investments, and includes a range of projections along several different time horizons and a risk framework for adaptive capacity and understanding consequences from sea level rise. As everybody in this room knows, since 2012, there have been recent advances in sea level rise science, including a better understanding on ice loss science and the associated implications for sea level rise. You've also heard several times earlier today about the multiple policy drivers that are really focusing the state and local entities to incorporate sea level rise into their planning. That includes the Governor Brown's recent executive order directing state agencies to prepare for and adapt to climate change, and SB 379, which is going to require cities and counties to incorporate climate change in their planning. So because the users of the existing sea level rise guidance document are now including both state and local agencies, and because of the need to update the state of the science, OPC is now underway in updating the state sea level rise guidance document. And I'll just describe, this process is happening in 2 steps. The first step is really focusing on summarizing the best available science, including ice loss contributions to sea level rise. So there is a working group of the OPC's Science Advisory Team that's being coordinated by the California Ocean Science Trust, and they're compiling the latest climate research, including recent scientific advances in ice loss dynamics. The working group includes subject matter experts in coastal processes, risk assessment, climatic change, ice loss, and ice sheet behavior, and then statistical modeling. And they're going to integrate the latest science into a the latest peer-reviewed science into a science summary, and that summary is going to be delivered to the Ocean Protection Council at their April 26th meeting. In addition to identifying the latest science, we are also about to engage, or in the process of engaging in a really robust public engagement process. We're soliciting input from users of the guidance document, including local planners, state agencies, and other stakeholders. And that process is underway now and will continue over the next several months. So there are a range of interviews that are currently underway to understand how folks are using the guidance document right now. And then that information will feed into how the policy is developed to be best usable for all of the range of audiences. So as we move into summer, there's going to be a series of public workshops with state, regional, and local stakeholders to share the science findings and solicit feedback on how they will utilize the guidance document. And this will help update the policy, help guide the update of the policy document. And then finally, we will use that information to update the guidance, and we will bring that for final approval before the Ocean Protection Council in January of 2018. So this is just a timeline. I passed out a few handouts that really go through the process and provide the timeline and opportunities for engagement. And what would be really helpful to understand from this group is how you can help us engage your constituents, state and local stakeholders who can really help inform how they're using the guidance, how the information could be best presented to them so that it will be usable in the future, and how we can present the science so that it's understandable. So I think that's really what these three questions are highlighting. So how can this group contribute to the public outreach that's currently underway so that folks know that this process is happening and that they can engage. And then subsequently letting folks know that the guidance, there's a draft of a guidance document out and how they can provide comments. And third, how would this group directly like to participate in both the kind of effort underway now to understand how it's being used and then to provide input on the guidance itself.
Thank you. Are there questions for Jen? Bruce?
Just on the input that you're going to be after from the public and from stakeholders, I'm not clear. Is that about the science? I mean, if your science says 8 or 9 feet we're getting, and do you want the public to come say, no, it's 4 or something?
No.
Or is it about how to use the guidance?
Yeah, we are not soliciting input or opinion on the science itself. Thank you for that clarification. Yeah, we really want to understand if and how people are using this guidance document now, if there are things that could be done better in a subsequent version of the guidance document, what does that look like? So that type of feedback so that we can make sure that we are providing the policy guidance built onto what the science is saying these projections should be.
Ashley Conrad-Seda, Cal EPA. I mean, I think in response to that first question, this group could really help in terms of the networks that in which we all engage to see how sea level rise has some impact on those communities. And in part, you know, yes, the entirety of our state is hemmed in by ocean on one side, but those impacts will go inland to some extent. And so sort of getting a sense of how far inland they'll go, how far-reaching the effects will be felt, and how much all of these communities around here will be impacted by sea level rise, I think would be helpful. Because I think for people living inland, it's just not something that rises to the top of our radar all the time. But those impacts, whether it means we're going to have refugees from the coast or whether it means we actually will see bigger storm surges or we're going to see the Yolo bypass flooded more often, those types of things I think would be really helpful to spell out for this group so that we can think about impacts on our networks statewide.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. This is of the issues when I talk to folks in my city, when I told them I'm going to be on this committee, this is the one that came up the most as giving them the most heartburn. And I think a lot of it is really, one is that the projections that come out of here are, obviously there are a lot of sensitivities to them, especially from the development community and other folks, and how we talk about them is also really important. So I'm glad you're doing the community output or the community engagement sessions or whatever those are. Are there going to be, I think from our perspective, from San Francisco's perspective, there's concerns that we're doing a lot of our own work and trying to understand the science, and that we're coming up with our own guidance, and there's concerns that the state could come in and then change that whole picture. And so I'm wondering how you are going to take like local community input on your, into your, and I know that scientists are like engineers, it's hard to get them to agree on anything. So how is that going to happen? And then is this something that will be regularly updated, or is there any thought around allowing local jurisdictions to supersede some of the recommendations if they've done more like detailed science on their communities or their areas?
Yeah, I think those are really great questions. So I'll try to address the first one about how this kind of rolls out from the state to the locals. And as it stands right now, this is state guidance that provides projections over certain time scales. At this point, the Ocean Protection Council in the current guidance recommended using the top 2/3 of the projections as a precautionary measure. At this time, it's unclear exactly what the recommendations are going to be coming out of our science working group. But we are in close coordination with the state agencies and local communities to kind of understand how this is going to get rolled out, right? So this will be guidance that will then be integrated into local planning. So I think to a certain extent, the Coastal Commission is going to need to update their sea level rise guidance document. And so really being thoughtful about how this is as statewide guidance rolled out to the local communities is something that we're in the process of thinking through. And then your question about how often are we going to update this? I think that's an excellent question that we are currently talking about. I think because the science is evolving so quickly, there is potentially the need to update this very frequently, maybe 1 year or 2 years. So we're considering that.
Are you also working with regional entities like BCDC?
Absolutely. So we have, at least at the state level, we have a group of coastal management agencies called the COCAT. They're the Coast and Ocean sector of the state's climate action team. So we're coordinating closely with them. And then we also have an engagement team that we're working with, Susie Moser and Climate Action, who are working on these interviews and listening sessions, and those listening sessions are going to be scheduled in the next few weeks and are really going to be targeted at, they're trying to determine if they should be focused geographically or really on the type of user of the guidance document. So maybe you have all consultants that are supporting municipalities in their planning efforts, so maybe there would be a listening session targeted at that user. So we are working very closely with BCDC and the other coastal state management agencies and using those folks as a network to get out to the locals. And again, I am looking to all of you to help us with that outreach and engagement. We really want your feedback and support on that.
What's BDCD? BCD?
The San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission.
It's an arm of the state.
Okay. My question was about the Bay Delta, the place that I think sea level rise touches the most inland Californians is through that water supply, and I'm curious if part of your guidance reaches in that far or if there's someone else who's taking point on that.
No, our guidance is going to address that as well, and we're also talking with folks from the Delta Stewardship Council and others because we recognize that's an important part of this.
Thanks.
So OPC and OPR have been working together because the general plan guidelines includes a Coastal Act section, but there are also likely to be sea level rise impacts that are outside of the coastal zone. So there's a need to have sea level rise discussions that aren't just specific to the statutorily designated coastal zones. and there's also the BCDC and the Delta Commission connections as well. So I just wanted to highlight that the general plan guidelines refers to the sea level rise guidance document, and we will be updating that section as this document is updated as well.
I was going to say that. Thank you.
Sorry, one quick question. In terms of your call for support and outreach, are there certain groups or stakeholders that you're not seeing involved that you'd like to see more involved? And I think similar to Ashley's point, I think, Michael, you're kind of covering this, but for us to kind of have an understanding of what impacts are coming down the line so that we know to be how we can be targeted in terms of getting more stakeholders engaged in this type of process without, because it's important for us to be very targeted because folks can get bombarded with so much information. So how do we make sure we're targeted so people don't roll their eyes when we start talking about climate change, but they're really engaged. But just kind of want to get a sense from you where you think that there's some stakeholder groups that are maybe lacking in the conversation.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think we're trying to cast as wide a net as possible to make sure that the public is aware and engaged to the extent that they want to be. I also think there is a focus on kind of the practitioner side. How is this guidance going to be used in planning and permitting and investing going forward? So I think that's a targeted stakeholder group. I will say that we are going to schedule a series of public workshops between May and June. Those dates will be forthcoming, and I will be sure to share them with this group. And yeah, again, we're just trying to cast a wide net so we can solicit as much information as possible.
Just a quick comment. I think the guidance that you're coming out with, and from what I've heard from stakeholders who have heard about it and heard about the numbers, this could be a great case study for this group because this is going to happen in other sectors as well and not just sea level rise, although those of us on the coast are mostly focused on sea level rise. This change in the science at a significant level, which is happening, is going to be something we're also going to face in other sectors. And I don't have an answer, but I think it would be a good topic for us to consider. When we're telling planners it's X you should be planning for, and then a few years later we're saying it's 3X, that's going to happen in other topics as well.
Yeah.
Thanks. Any other questions? So,
Ashley, again, Bruce's comment made me think about just these, larger goals for the group, that maybe this is an area that we can tackle as a larger goal, which is how do you rapidly incorporate changing science or changing information so that you're constantly kind of adjusting what your resilient outcome looks like. Or how do we develop a resilient outcome that incorporates that rapidly changing science? And we're dealing with this obviously in the forestry space too, where we're seeing 106 million dead trees and wildfires that are burning at 500,000 acres per year. So we have that experience in the state with emergency response and cleanup sites and everything like that. We actually have a precedent. So it might be wise to look at those two examples and figure out how we can build that into some of our early outcomes of this group.
Anyone else? Okay. Oh, yep. Okay.
Sorry, couldn't resist. But with regards to sea level rise in this notion of local citywide change versus regional change, can you give me some insight into the thinking with regards to where's the appropriate planning space with regards to this issue? Local, citywide, or regional, or statewide?
Another great question. I think it's, these impacts can be very localized depending on the regional topography, and in the northern part of the state, we're actually seeing, because the land is going up, we're seeing lower rates of sea level rise than in the southern parts of the state. So I think it really depends on a variety of issues, including kind of
the local environment, and then also the local kind of government, community engagement, and desire to engage in these types of processes. I mean, I will say that there's now kind of there will be a legal requirement to incorporate sea level rise in planning with the nexus to the general plan guidelines. So I think that kind of outlines the planning scope to a certain extent. And then overlaid with that will be kind of coastal commissions, local coastal plans, and yeah.
Okay. One other concept to kind of layer in here is the time frame over which these plans are being made. And to Ashley's point about how do you incorporate rapidly changing science, how do you incorporate if you're planning for 2050 or 2100 and there's greater uncertainty around the scientific predictions in 2100? And I don't know what the guidance is within what you're developing through OPR. Not going to get the name right. What's the city guidance?
The general plan?
Thank you, general plan. What the timeline is there and how you deal with all that. So maybe that's something else that we should be discussing in this council.
Thank you. Great. Thank you, Jen.
Thanks.
So we'll go to our final presentation from Kif Shore from the Local Government Commission on financing, and then we'll have questions about that and come back to a broader discussion. I think some really helpful topics have come up already.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm Kif Shore. I'm the Climate and Energy Program Director at the Local Government Commission. I'm really glad to be part of this conversation. I think I heard somebody refer to financing as the elephant in the room. So I hope that I'm just the elephant minder for the next 10 minutes. And I know this is a topic that I'm not speaking from within a set of guidance or a set of agency protocols, so this is probably going to generate a lot of conceptual and big picture conversation about where this council is going, which I'm very supportive of, but I probably don't have very many answers for you. I'll prompt more discussion than anything else. So with that, I just wanted to set up a couple of framing thoughts for you. As we've heard quite a bit today already, financing adaptation is a moving target. We are seeing change, and change is accelerating all across the globe, but of course in California. And this gives rise to a situation where any response we might undertake is going to be challenged by the variations, as I think Ashley was pointing out, in where, how, and to what degree impacts are going to happen. And that's obviously a very big financing question. For example, we just talked about sea level rise. We talked about drought and the millions of trees that are dead. Each of those require an investment to respond, but those investments might draw resources from some other impact. And if we can't actually know which ones to invest in at what point, how can we prioritize these investments? It becomes a very fundamentally challenging question as we look forward, especially 30, 50, 100 years. But that's not the only change that's accelerating around us. And I included this picture, this kind of silly picture of an autonomous vehicle, because there's a lot of technological changes in particular, but other societal changes that are also accelerating and moving around us and may confound, conflict, or in some cases benefit our ability to plan for climate change through investment. So autonomous vehicles are one that is happening rapidly. It's happening all around us, though with the accident in Arizona this week, it may be slowing down. But AV presents some compelling environmental benefits through congestion reduction, through ride sharing and other factors, but it also is likely going to dramatically impact local revenues and potentially in a negative way. So when we need money to manage transportation-related climate impacts and this technology change is coming along, we may be losing revenue simultaneously, so we're looking to tackle a problem that we've just reduced the pie to address. So we need to think about these levers, think about how these things are interacting, and look beyond just climate impacts when we talk about financing. We need to look at the full picture of social change that's going on around us. So those are just some framing thoughts. Most of what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is share results, preliminary results from the project that we're involved in for the 4th climate assessment on financing adaptation. Really, we're looking at the landscape, and it's a pretty thin story so far. I've also got a little bit of information from the annual planning survey that I'll pepper in there. But again, this is tentative information, so just really to get your thoughts going on what the landscape looks like. It's mostly focused on local governments, and that's where sort of the results are coming from so far. So In our literature review process, we looked across a number of adaptation plans that in some form or fashion addressed adaptation. And what we found were about 15 that actually had tabular data, numerical estimates of things like impacts and things like how to implement. These are just a couple examples I wanted to put up because they represent two different coastal communities. So some comparison, but they're very different in size. Goleta is a very small city, San Francisco obviously much larger. And what you see here is that, not surprisingly, there's a variation in the amount of impact estimates and also the implementation response estimates. But the scale, the relative scale of those are also varied. It's not like there's an even incremental factor between the two. It's not surprising. These are two different communities looking at this. But we saw this across the board, and it really speaks to the very nascent sense with which communities are estimating both impacts and implementation costs. This is a very immature science, and if it even rises to the level of science. Additionally, we have no real way to guess at this point how impacts may affect implementation costs. So if something swings wildly in one direction or another, you might blow out that impact cost and change the implementation cost. On the other side, if we start actually institutionalizing some of our adaptation-related activities, we might see implementation budgets helping to manage those impact costs. So those things need to be thought about together, and it's just, again, food for thought. Looking at the annual planning survey, one of the things they ask about is adaptation plans, policies, and programs in other documents. And this shows a ranking of where they're appearing, either adopted documents, completed, or in progress. And what you see is that the sort of general policy documents that have been out there around there have the greatest penetration, if you will, of adaptation-related elements. It's still quite low. I mean, it's on the order of 40%, 20% for adopted language. But as you look further down for specific language that relates to adaptation more specifically, more squarely, it's much lower rates of penetration. And I think that's important. This is still very much working its way out into the local communities as far as what they're doing. We also asked, turning to our fourth assessment survey research, we surveyed, right now we've got an online survey that has about 171 responses in it. And we asked a wide range of questions about the communities, where they're spending money, if they're spending money. So far in results, we've had about 40% of the respondents are from cities of 500,000 to 1 million, with 30% on either side. So a pretty good distribution of community responses. We're also seeing about 50% are cities, 30% are counties, 9% regional, and the balance are some other types of agencies. And one of the key questions we asked is, have you spent money on adaptation? And if so, on what? And so this slide shows a distribution for those who said they'd spent money on adaptation over the last 2 years. What were they spending it on? So we had about 63% of that 171 who spent some money on adaptation. Not surprisingly, what you see is that about half are spending it on figuring out where they're at and maybe what their initial planning process is going to look like. So they spend it on either risk or vulnerability assessments or adaptation planning. Far less is on implementation, though I was surprised, 17%, that's encouraging. 22% on community engagement. We talked a little bit before, I think, in the last presentation on getting the word out. Locals see that as just as a part and parcel of their consideration of how to spend money on adaptation is community engagement. And then, of course, far less on anything related to monitoring or other. Over the next 5 years, we also asked them, what do you think you're going to be spending money on? And I think this is encouraging. The balance shifts quite dramatically from what is looking like about 40 down from 50% to about 30% on the assessment and planning, and far more on implementation and monitoring. But community engagement remains a very strong portion of what needs to be spent among the folks who were responding to this. Another interesting data point from the survey for us was we asked for those who were spending money on adaptation, where are they getting this money from? And the top 3 choices are general fund, state agency grants, and foundation grants. Those aren't surprising, but that's a limited universe to be drawing funding from, and one that is, of course, finite in many ways. Interestingly, things like fees, bond funding, and special taxes, these are very revenue-specific mechanisms, were much lower rates of penetration. And I think that that's both an opportunity and a barrier depending on how we structure these things. Clearly getting votes to tax yourself can be very hard to do, but it also creates a special purpose that might result in dedicated funding streams. We also asked folks about the challenges, and I apologize, probably you can't read this, but I hope you have the slides in front of you. We asked a range of challenges related to funding. And these were drawn from some of the literature and work that's been done on barriers to adaptation that are out there. And what you see here are really, to my mind, and this is again very preliminary, two real clusters that reflect the kinds of barriers that are out there. First, it's about the access to funding. It's about our ability to either staff the grant writing, to have the funding, to know how to cost it. This is about trying to get a sense of the funding itself. Secondarily, it's about the requirements and the structures related to funding. So those are two different things, and it's important to understand that these are major barriers that are facing folks, and they're not just because it's obvious they don't have enough money, that goes without saying, but we see some structural and some opportunity barriers related to the funding. So to summarize really quickly, some of the financing challenges that we saw in the survey results and in the literature we looked at, and I think these reflect a good chunk of what you all have been talking about today. The variability in climate projections affects people's ability to fund and finance because they don't know that they're going to make effective investments in particular areas because the landscape is changing over different time frames. There's limited guidance on integration of adaptation into existing mechanisms, which leads to a failure, potential failures to leverage existing investments. Folks are spending money on infrastructure all the time, but they may not be making adaptive investments, and that's a lost opportunity. There's limited flexibility in existing funding sources. So the structure of funding is a major factor that affects what people fund, and until we start to unwind those, lift them up, or maybe create incentives as opposed to barriers, folks aren't going to make those investments, not because they don't want to, but maybe because they can't. There's limited resources for interjurisdictional action. To the question about where is the appropriate space to act, it may in some cases be at the city level because that's what we can do. Until we fund regional scale activities, we can't actually implement regional scale activities. Not that that's not going on entirely, but it is a barrier to many people. There's also limited opportunities to grow the funding. We know we need more. There's not enough funding out there, so how do we actually increase the available funding for adaptation by redesigning it or retasking it? And finally, and perhaps most significantly, there's the absence of a financial market for adaptation. It is not part of the DNA of investment currently in the private sector or even in some of the public investment mechanisms. And until we build that, it's going to be really hard to wholesale start to shift resources towards adaptation at scale, which is clearly needed. So I guess in closing, or to hand it off to you, these are the three questions that we worked on developing for you all to take up. Again, I think they're slightly larger picture questions related to this topic, not related to a specific piece of guidance, but what role can you all play in identifying and understanding critical adaptation financing needs? Where are these opportunities? How can the TAC help to identify the best opportunities to leverage existing and or new financing and funding to yield the best adaptation benefits? How can we do more with what we have? And finally, what role can the TAC play in defining essential outcomes for resiliency investments so we can help state, local, private, and other decision makers move towards a more broadly shared approach? Because if we're going to invest, we need to invest at scale across all levels, so we need to be working with a similar playbook for how to evaluate what it means to make a resilient investment. So I guess I'll answer questions if there's any for me, or just turn it over to you, Louise.
Great. Thanks, Kif. Mike?
Yeah, I guess I'm first to ask each time, huh? Maybe I should stop doing that.
Well, I guess you're right. You know,
yeah,
if you want, I can go.
No.
I just see it.
Those big billions that San Francisco is facing in potential impact. Where's the insurance companies on all this? Aren't they noticing that there's a financial model to go and solve the problem cheaper than pay for the problem once it's broken? Is that coming? Is that market coming?
I mean, there are some people working on that. There's some folks at an organization called Refocus Partners who've been building out some models around catastrophe bonds and resiliency investments for catastrophe bonds. Not my area of expertise.
Yeah, I mean, I can try to answer some of those questions. There's not much going on there, and I think the resiliency bonds and catastrophe bonds are trying to build upon recapturing recapturing the losses, potential losses from insurance, or trying to recapture. We were looking at interruption insurance, for instance, business interruption insurance for those businesses that have them. One, a lot of businesses don't, and I think we were going to have some discussions about the California Earthquake Authority around earthquakes. Is a similar situation. Very few people, probably very few people in this room, have earthquake insurance. So it's a challenging, I think it's a really challenging source to get at, and I have not seen anything that really would suggest that, I mean, part of it's also the way that insurance has evolved and the way they do these things in the secondary insurance markets, and there really is not a place where that value of having an enhanced, a more secure future because of, better sea level rise adaptation projects exists. It just isn't there right now.
It just seems to me like the big reinsurers that are like handling your wastewater treatment plant or your airport would charge you a bundle if they thought you were not protecting it, right?
Yeah, well, for one thing, San Francisco is self-insured, like a lot of large cities and a lot of large jurisdictions across the country. And yeah, I think it's just hard for them to grasp what the benefit is going to be by providing that, by having this additional protection. I mean, to some extent, they're counting on the government coming in and being able to help them recover, right? Which is what we did in New Orleans, or, not that they've completely recovered, but I think that it's, so there's still not a lot of, maturity in that market. And I don't know, I know there's a lot of people promoting it and talking about it. I just don't know that it's there. And I think to some extent we're, the financial mechanisms we have, I think we're probably going to really need to look at how those can be prioritized, or how you can begin to have more projects with multiple benefits. So you're not just doing, a seawall unto itself, but you're combining it with other benefits at the same time. Or if you're going to build a big transportation infrastructure, that also incorporates sea level rise into that infrastructure that you're doing.
Thanks. And then why don't we just go down the line? We'll do Kaylee, Mo, and then Sakita.
So, yeah, Kaylee E. with the Natural Resources Agency. So, to the insurance point, and I think you can probably speak more to it from Tuolumne County, but it's the stories we're hearing now that personal insurance is being interrupted by risk to homes from dead and dying trees and the fire risk. So, just the availability of insurance to the private consumers being interrupted right now. I don't know if that's what you were going to talk about. So maybe you should jump, and then I can come back in a second.
So again, for us, it's the fire. During the Rim Fire, it was the third largest California fire that we had experienced. Yet there were very few losses of any type of home. There was one or two homes and some outbuildings. It was mostly our landscape and infrastructure in our economy that got hit. Yet our homeowners are just being devastated by their insurance. If you even ask your insurance company for a new quote and you've been with them for 25 years, they're canceling you because you have a certain company. There are wholehearted companies that are just pulling out of our communities. Lloyd's of London has been one of the few that you can get, but someone who is paying a premium of maybe $5,000–6,000 a year are now paying $25,000 to $35,000 a year. People are not being able to sell their homes. People are not being able to buy homes just because they can't get insurance. And now that we're one of the central points, as you're mentioning, for the bark beetle and the dying trees, is becoming even more so an issue for us. We've been going and working with the insurance commissioner and trying to get their attention on this, but it's getting harder and harder for both our residents and then businesses to want to come into California and be an economic base that we want to be, and yet have to face these things with the insurance company.
No, and you just have to imagine that will replicate itself over different policy areas as risks are experienced and firsthand, and then they're kind of projected upon places that will have, that face similar risks. I was going to ask you about the implementation questions that were asked in the survey. And, when you asked respondents about implementation, do you know what they were considering were thinking was, what they thought implementation was. Was it a consistent set of actions? Was it kind of widely varied? Because what we've seen in our own state programs is that we do a lot of investment in adaptation actions that don't often get rolled up into the same kind of thinking space as adaptation. So they're often, sometimes they're collected as adaptation wins, and other times they're just kind of set aside as programmatic things that we do. And we often miss opportunities to talk about the good that we're doing because we just don't kind of check those actions as adaptation. So,
yeah, I don't have the data right with me. We did ask to pick it apart a little bit, and I can get back to you with what that looks like. But I wholeheartedly agree. I think there are situations where we hear from folks that they are taking actions that they don't consider to be adaptation, but that could be. These are these investments in infrastructure they're making that could be made better. So sometimes lifting that up could be of value for sure.
Thank you. First, I have a very quick question, then I had a couple comments. And you may have covered this. Who were you surveying through this study?
Principally local government staff.
Okay. And is it local governments throughout the state, or okay, so every area in the state was represented in this?
I mean, we tried.
Right.
You know how local governments can be. And the distribution was skewed to certain areas, coastal areas. We got more representation in some of the major metro areas. I could also get you the distribution if you're interested.
Yeah, actually.
And I can fully acknowledge it is not 100% well sampled evenly.
Yeah, no, definitely. And that's fine. Yeah, because it'd be great to kind of understand who was in there responding and who was not, and kind of why. If it's, there's some folks that just based on what's coming down with climate change, their groups are just a lot more organized and involved and at the table and in these conversations. And there's some groups that are not, and part of it could be resources. And somebody mentioned something about technical assistance and kind of having the resources and technical assistance to actually participate and really understanding the science of what's, going to be impacting their community. If they're, a small farm worker community that's dealing with a lot of drought and extreme heat days, and, kind of that connect, and those are areas that, from a political standpoint, are not always the most climate change policy friendly, and so there might not be as much awareness and activity in some areas. But yeah, so it would be great to kind of have a look at that and see kind of what, kind of overlaying who's engaged in something like this, which I think is amazing, and what communities are actually going to see the most impacts from a science standpoint. Are those actually matching up? Because ideally you want those communities engaged. And
if I could say just one thing on that, we also sort of complemented this with a series of workshops around the state, and it's also mirrors as well. In LA and in the Bay Area, we got pretty strong attendance. In Fresno, we had 3 or 4 people. It was very, very hard to get people to come, both, I think, for many of those reasons. Though I will say, in that case, actually, one of the prime participants was one of the strongest advocacy groups, Leadership Council, came to that, which was great to see because it was a different set of voices.
Right. That's great. I guess the other points I'll make is kind of just encouraging for this group to think along the same lines of how, when this magical pot of money just will appear for us, it will undoubtedly be limited. And so how are we thinking about being very targeted and intentional about where we're funding? So, we have numbers and understanding what the costs are going to be, and then also understanding what kind of the existing economic realities are within a community. And so a price tag for some coastal communities, there might be more of an ability to meet that, whereas there's other communities that it's just, there's so many other costs and limited resources that there's a need to understand both, the price tag as well as what is the existing, socioeconomic status of the different communities that we need to ensure are resilient. And then as we're thinking about financing, and I'm kind of putting on I do a lot of work in the mitigation space. And so when we start looking, again, we're going to get our magical pot, and we're just going to start investing. We're just going to make it rain money everywhere, and we're going to be super resilient. That we have to think about being very intentional about wealth gaps. And, you know, once you start putting a lot of money into infrastructure, we deal a lot with this in the mitigation side. You start looking at things like gentrification and displacement. You start looking at, you know, who are, you know, what small businesses have access to kind of this funding that would come through. And there's really opportunities to be very inclusive and intentional about how we think about financing. That could be, if we don't do it, it could be very problematic, and if we do, it could be incredibly beneficial. And somebody threw out the word co-benefits, you know, really thinking about everything that these communities are dealing with, and making sure that we're aware of it and providing co-benefits where possible while remaining kind of very targeted around climate adaptation. So that's something that might come down the road, but just something to think about.
I was just thinking about, this is, sorry, Ashley Kelly, PA, was thinking about a potential first product from the TAC, thinking about what we heard today from Senator Wajkowski, that he's trying to crochet together little bits of funding. This isn't a topic that's really well known within the legislature. It might be good to take some of these study results and then a few case studies, so you could show weed and the rim fire and the cost to actually clean up after those fires, and then the ongoing cost to try to embed resiliency in those communities as a case study. And then you could do sort of an inland flooding one where you're looking at the effects of this winter on some farming communities. So you could look at that impact on ag, and then you could do another one like a king tide's impact on some coastal community. So if we could put together 3 case studies on what the actual cost was of that impact, set with these survey results, and talk a little bit about, you know, spending now versus spending later, the discount rate. You know, if we spent now on adaptation, what would we be saving later? Here are some examples of case studies where there's been a disaster and the state, locals, individuals have had to pay to cover the cleanup costs. So that might be a nice first product of the TAC to educate the legislature, so that when Wajkowski is trying to bring these bills to the fore, or others are trying to find any funding for adaptation, there's an opportunity to say, okay, why? Why do we need to do this? What is it going to cost my community? And we really connect to that. And that would bring in some of the equity and justice issues as well, because you could pick case studies that aren't just from areas where the socioeconomics allow individuals to cover the cost. So that was just one thought I had. And then the other piece is sort of longer term, but these longer term cost benefit analyses where you look at a discount rate and you look out at the, you know, the cost of responding to a disaster in the future versus addressing it now. And that's much more academic and probably not as helpful to the legislature, but could be good, something good to be kind of working on along the way.
I actually really like your case studies idea, and would want to urge this group to think about doing one for the rural farm worker communities across the state where adaptation is happening now. Right. And there's a lot of questions about if you're a community 50 miles outside of the largest major population center and economic center, and there aren't any jobs coming back to your community for many, many, many years. How do you, like, what is the conditions in which you adapt? Is it building infrastructure for that community and building it out? Is it helping them transition? Like, I think those are really worthy questions for this group to sort out. So I just wanted to put that out there. And the second thing I wanted to add to this is on the financing side, so just a little bit of an example of how this has worked in the San Joaquin Valley. I used to work for the city of Fresno, where we recently basically raised $600 million through new water rate revenues to completely refinance our water system and to build surface water infrastructure and to basically get the city off of groundwater. And while that was a flat water rate increase across the city, so not a very equitable way of raising funds, we were able to do affordability credits and that sort of thing to sort of minimize some of the equity impacts on a lot of communities, and we're able to really sort of build out a new infrastructure for the city, and that's just something to keep in mind.
Michael?
Is it on? Oh, thanks. So, unlike many of you, I don't work for a local government, but our nonprofit organization is a community development financial institution, and as we're thinking about the lack of a market or market and financing for this kind of an issue. The community development financial institutions are pretty good at addressing capital needs that the private markets are not yet addressing. We're a small community, but for example, our fund is about $130 million, and we only serve rural communities. But where we can have an impact is in pre-development kind of financing, gap financing, and bridging financing. So to give you an example, Crescent City, when they had to rebuild their harbor, they had lined up FEMA, OES, and the Community Development Block Grant and other money to rebuild the harbor and create a tsunami, 100-year tsunami-proof facility. Where we came in was we provided an $8 million bridge loan, which enabled the harbor district to pay their contractor timely. Their FEMA and other money was coming in, but it would take 120 days to get paid. So we advanced a line of credit that enabled monthly payments to the contractor, and so our $8 million leveraged the $40-50 million project. So when you think about the toolbox of ways to finance projects like this, I would encourage you to include CDFIs. And then also, since CDFI's mission is to serve underserved markets, and in our CAC in particular, we work around water infrastructure in rural communities. A key component to making those infrastructure projects happen is provision of technical assistance. Part of your survey was lack of staff capacity to apply for grants. That's a key role that an organization like ours does. So if and when the state can come up with funding for this kind of project, I hope that it targets disadvantaged communities and also provides technical resources for that.
On that note, I went to a meeting, the Rockefeller Foundation pulled together a meeting of CDFIs to talk about resilience as part of a national conference in Atlanta. And another role that one mentioned playing, which made me think of our project in Tuolumne County, was also helping to bond local contractors. So for some of these large-scale projects that often local contractors don't have the insurance to be able to do, they also can help to be able to employ local labor forces. Okay, I don't know what order, so I'm just going to go down the line. Jana, if that's okay.
Thank you. So one of the things I think we're bumping up against as a group a little bit is that adaptation funding often is a patchwork of many different buckets, right? So obviously everyone knows this who pulls together these patchworks for any given project. You guys probably have all heard about this, but there's a database of state incentives for renewables and efficiency. So one of the things we could think about for this group is exploring a clearinghouse of funding opportunities, funding areas, if we don't have it already. We may even have it already. But the acronym for this database is DESIRE, D-S-I-R-E. It could be that we pull together a number of different funding sources for a number of different projects that loosely fit into the adaptation bucket, and specifically pair adaptation with mitigation. It seems like there's a number of models out there already. It could just be a kind of a working committee to focus on that piece and see what we come up with, but that would be a suggestion.
Thanks, Kip, for the presentation. It was very good, and it's really exciting to see some of the results of the fourth climate assessment funding, which has been kicking around for a while. I just wondered if the notion of financial markets for adaptation, if you have examples, if you anticipate having examples in that, or really, what else does that look like? What have you run into besides these resilience bond idea?
I mean, I think those are the kinds of things that I think about. I also think about when, we set terms for grants, that we have a consistent framework and a consistent set of guidelines, to the point of kind of layering rebates or grants that are out there. The state could start at its own and create a standard playbook. I think that some of that work is happening with the guidance, the investment and planning guidance. That helps to create a market. Setting terms for investment strategies, I think right now there is a bill, I don't know how many legs it has, but to require CalPERS to consider climate impacts in its portfolio. That would create a market. That's the kind of stuff that I think about.
Yes, thank you for this presentation. So funding and financing is always the most challenging, and I feel like that's something that we're grappling with from local to state. And I agree that there are a lot of models out there, and thinking about Los Angeles, like I think about Measure M, like I feel like there's a lot of stuff in particular around kind of transit-oriented development and transportation, and how there's just so much, like that's the hot thing right now, kind of just money being funneled into transit-oriented development. So looking at those kind of bond measures, like with Measure M, looking at Prop 1, thinking about water, looking at what the local returns can be, I think that there are often guidelines that tend to keep the communities that a lot of us want to be represented out and, from having access to those dollars. So I feel like groups like us are always trying to advocate to change guidelines so that they can be more inclusive. And even when you're looking at things like the Cal Enviro screen, it's like you have a 2.0 and then a 3.0 because of all this advocacy that's happened where folks are like, hey, it's leaving hugely disadvantaged communities out. So we need to expand this even more. And then I think that there's like some, I want to say it's in Ohio, like there's some particular counties where they're looking at bond measures around water. And then that's also something that we're exploring in Los Angeles, just trying to figure out what a bond measure can be to help with the water infrastructure, and in particular, trying to make more permeable grounding to have kind of aquifers underneath and do, stormwater capture, et cetera. So I think there's some models that we can probably share from LA that you may be aware of, and then some things that are just kind of percolating right now that's on the table.
Yeah, thank you, and certainly welcome that. And I know Nintara is going to be collecting many of those examples, I think, as part of ICARP's mission. But I think it's a very emerging practice. I mean, I was thinking about green infrastructure as well, to your point, Louis, as far as, where is things happening. The source watershed bill that now lets us pay for watershed improvements as infrastructure, those are changing the definitions of what it means to invest, what it means to pay, what it means to how you count these things. And we need to, it seems like this group, this council, stands a good chance of setting the terms to that third question there. What is that framework that we want to look for across many places?
I guess the other implication to thinking about bond measures is just the civic engagement that needs to happen, and thinking about the civic engagement infrastructure that needs to be in place, because I believe it's a 66 kind of 2/3 requirement, and so they are pretty hard to pass. So it really would require kind of working with local groups if you do like a pulse on the community and folks aren't necessarily excited about another tax. But there are infrastructures that exist that can really push back and do a lot of outreach and education if folks really do see the local returns coming back to their communities.
Ashley just left, so I didn't get a chance to riff off of her idea while she was still here. But she was talking about sort of a catalog of best practices or case studies. And it occurs to me that, and this is something that you just mentioned too, is that, and it's been talked about a lot today, that there are things that people are doing that are adaptive that they don't know that they're adaptive, and it'd be really valuable to try to find ways of teasing those out. But then I think also it'd be really useful to start talking about the incremental cost above existing expenditures that becomes adaptive, right? Because we spend tons of money all the time. And this goes back to my maladaptive question from earlier, right? If we're repaving roads, how much more does it cost to use a more reflective material, right? If we're planting trees, how much does it cost to plant the right shade trees as opposed to the one we've always used, right? So like trying to express that incremental cost piece as the challenge rather than the whole cost, because we're going to spend that money anyway fixing the road, but we're going to fix it smarter, and that costs a little bit more. Because if we can make that case that that incremental cost exists, the places that are well-heeled enough to do it can. They can say, oh, and that's a good political message. We're just going to spend a little bit more to make it better. And we can also target dollars from state grants and whatnot at the incremental and say, you can get this money if you do that old thing smarter. And you have to fund the old part. We'll give you the new part to be smarter, right? It feels like that making that case that there's incremental costs that are valuable targets for policy and thinking and communication might be really useful.
Kip, wonderful results from your project and all. As you pointed out at the beginning, you're not a state agency, unlike the first two presentations. So my question really is, you know, we've identified in a number of meetings over the last few years, and we're doing it here now, how critically important this is, probably the #1 issue. And it doesn't seem still that anyone's in charge, or that anyone's, you know, Ocean Protection Council was given the charge to create a guidance and to update it. OPR got the charge for blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. You know, who's going to take this one on, and what role could we play in getting someone to take it on? We can't do the work because we're not a committee that can do work, but I'll stop there. Who's going to take this one on? Because there's some great work going on it, but are we putting the information together about all these different strategies that people are trying and about the needs, or are we going to continue? I hated to hear the crochet word used by Wykowski, because that's what we've been doing, nickel and diming ourselves.
Yeah. Well, one thing I would just say is we can do the work. I think we as a council can do that work, and I think if we chose, maybe if we could maybe move to the conversation across all of the afternoon work plan elements, because to me, a number of things have emerged commonly across and interrelated across these efforts. You know, the idea of a couple of things. I think Ashley's idea on the case studies, and we could pick up and take on as a charge for ourselves, do we want to try to inform and build the case around what does it look like? We can add in the incremental. I mean, there's a number of pieces of this, talking about incremental costs, talking about impacts, the value of acting now versus later, et cetera. And our target audience could be, broadly speaking, funding opportunities, whether that is the legislature. I mean, that's honestly probably right now our biggest opportunity would be if the legislature tried to do something, but that could also help to support local initiatives like Measure AA or something else. But I think we could do that. So I think if we as a group decide we want to take that on, we could. I also think to that end, going back to our conversation from this morning, a task of taking on setting that goal and to use Sakita's words of thinking boldly, what is resilience? What is our AB 32 for adaptation and resilience? What does that look like? We can tie that to all types of work. You know, so yeah, I mean, so I think a lot of pieces came out here, and I do think as a council we are a working body, and we could decide we want to have a product that is a set of case studies, or it's a set of principles, or it's, you know, and we could have a target audience for that. So I think we can do that. Oh, Sakita, yeah, okay.
I think I'm just agreeing with this recent round of this conversation, but I think that it is, you know, pulling a lot of these numbers, and maybe there's opportunity for additional research, but really packaging that. And I think it'd be great to have findings and opinions from this group be really active in the mitigation space, because I think the conversation, you know, whether it's in the legislature or other agencies, it's really developed in a way as a result of the fact that there's a pot of money attached to it, and I think that it's you know, California is going to kick itself later if this group is not more involved in those mitigation conversations and kind of determining where that funding is going. And looking at kind of how we're investing and how we can get these co-benefits to the investment. So and even for this, like, I think that there should be, well, we had Ashley here, but, you know, folks that are working in that mitigation space and kind of have decision-making power within that should be really engaged in listening and attending these meetings, and vice versa. There should be representation for groups like this, you know, when Air Resources Board is having meetings and they're talking about investments or scoping plan and all of those things. So kind of the cross-pollination, I think there's opportunity for us to be very kind of intentional and bold about that, because I think, yeah, I think the state is we're gonna kick ourselves if we don't do more of that.
I would just follow up. I mean, I think the idea of case studies is a good one, but I don't want to just rely on case studies. I guess I've participated in a number of advisory councils and commissions where we produce a whole bunch of case studies, and some people find some of them useful, but often they just sort of get put on a website, and I don't know that anyone really looks at them. So I think that the idea of having sort of specific goals and objectives and building the case studies around them or using them as examples would be important, and I don't know if the right number is 3 or 4 or 10 or whatever, but making them very targeted I think is important, and that, you know, and that I think requires some work. It's going to require some work from us as a committee. It's going to require some staff work. I also think that we need to be looking at the, you know, we talked a little bit about the difference between what the local role versus regional versus state versus federal, and I do think that we should be active on all fronts. I think that's the idea of this committee. So I would expect that it makes sense for us to make some suggestions around things that the state could do specifically around whether it's regulations around the 2/3 majority, you know, voter requirement for geo bonds, or whether it's the cap and trade laws that we know are being debated, you know, right now as we speak, and what kind of role they can play. But it's also, I think, trying to have some influence, whatever it may be, at the federal level too, on some of the plans and programs that are coming out of there, and how California can influence that discussion. So my final comment on that is that that's a lot to chew on, and I think that part of it will be how you start to prioritize these different types of objectives.
Yeah, okay, we're on it. No, go ahead. Thank you.
One more question. So I was looking at the chart, and I see 7% are spending on monitoring and evaluation. I was curious to know if there are any specifics on what sort of parameters of evaluation and monitoring that they are implementing. Maybe because some of the inputs might be useful for, and only 30% are doing the actual implementation of the adaptation practices. And that number is exceeding to 23% in the next 5 years. So I was just curious to know if you have any measures of what sort of evaluations or monitoring they have in place.
I don't believe we do. You know, it's always a burden with surveys to how much can you ask about. I can go back and look and see if there were specific comments, but and that all that stuff is forthcoming in the 4th assessment, so certainly we can keep you apprised as the entire project proceeds.
Thank you. So I guess 2 contributions. One, we are using resilience as a metaphor. It's an ecological concept, right? And it involves disruption and evolution. Those things are in there. It's change. It's not stasis. And I think it's really, and the senator even was talking a little bit about this when he spoke, and you know, he was in what can be hazardous waters, that there are some things that we have today that we shouldn't keep having because they are too expensive or too difficult or too at risk in the new system. So I think sort of keeping that in mind, that we're talking about a change process and an evolutionary process, that's something that's important. That's the academic in me talking. And I talked myself out of remembering the other thing. Yep, it's gone. I'll put the card back up if it comes back.
Other thoughts at this point?
I do remember what it was.
Go.
Yeah. Okay, so talking bold here. a question. Well, how much would it cost if we said in 2020 all jurisdictions with plans will update them? Right? Because earlier we heard somebody saying there's a lot of places that are just head in the sand, they don't want to update. How much would it cost us politically and financially? Like what realm of universe am I even talking about if California said we're going to recode California in 2020 and everyone's going to come up to date on the standards of the plans?
General plans?
Yeah.
Actually, for general plans, there is a requirement for anybody that has a local hazard mitigation plan, they are required to update, at the next update to that LHMP, they're required to update the general plan to meet the new standards. So typically that's going to be within about a 5-year period, although LHMP, sometimes that time period varies. But for those folks without a LHMP, they have to update their general plan to incorporate adaptation by 2022.
Oh, okay.
So there is a mandate there. The larger question is there are mandates around other things that those deadlines have far passed, and yet there are still many plans out there that don't incorporate some of those other things as well. So just because it's a mandate doesn't fully mean it's going to be done.
What's the teeth of those mandates?
Well, if you're, yeah. Oh, sorry. Well, yeah. I mean, if you're not complying with law, then you're liable to be challenged. You know, your policy document is at risk for being challenged. It's got to have somebody to challenge it. That's the other question.
I mean, it's 375 is incentive based. I mean, it's CEQA streamlining. No, there's not a fund. Yeah. I mean, I guess it's 375. It is now the sustainable community strategies are tied to your regional transportation plan, and so therefore, and projects that move forward will only get funded if they are part of the regional transportation plan. So there you go. Okay. Oh, Danielle.
I would just push back against the putting a lot of stock into the plans strategy, only coming from a region where plans are only so far. They can only push you so far. We have sustainable community strategies, just to use the case of SB 375, are not necessarily resulting in really radical transformations of the way that the region thinks about vehicle miles traveled, thinks about transit. It's just another way of quantifying a lot of status quo patterns in the region. And then on top of it, just to go back to Kip's presentation, general plans to be implemented at need creative financing at the end of the day, and so I think that just has to be integrated into this as we move forward.
Anything else? Okay, so we've been conferring a little over here as just sort of taking this, if we want for the next step coming out of this discussion, I think is for us to sort of coalesce around a general sense of direction. So I'm going to throw out some ideas and would love thoughts on whether this is capturing, and there's a lot, so I know I'm not going to capture a lot of what was talked about. I think, though, step one, I would go back to the morning and then some of the things that were raised here, which I think challenging ourselves to put out that idea of the AB 32 for adaptation, for lack of a better word, of what does that look like from our, if we were to think boldly as a group, what are the what would we want to see? And that's a huge question. I don't think we need to have it take a lot of time, but I think it might be worth diving into that a bit, because it seems like we can then build a lot around that as it relates to some of the other elements that we have talked about here. And now I'm trying to find my little...
What was AB 31?
AB 32, sorry. So how we have mitigation goals for 2020, 2030. Could we craft something that says this is what we think California should look like this in 2020, and maybe there's a planning part of it, there's an infrastructure, we could think about what that would look like. So that seems like one that becomes important that we can build a lot around, and could go to inform a number of the planning conversations that are happening around the sea level rise element, and also outcomes for investments. I think it could also, then another piece that came out seemed like it had some interest, was the idea of how do we package a story around whether it's case studies or case studies plus, that sort of says, and I would think that is also, you could wrap in some of these other elements of our directive from legislation around integrated planning, around equity and environmental justice. Can we build that into that case study discussion that we think could help frame any conversation around financing, but again, could speak to planning and other pieces. And so those are kind of, and then there was another interest, I think, broadly speaking, I don't know, I've written things in many places, on the sea level rise piece, also that being an opportunity to engage in an ongoing topic where we have a nexus of state, local, and regional planning of changing science that is potentially a really good real-time example that would be something we could learn from for other sectors down the road. And that maybe even coupling that with the tree mortality forest piece as well. So that spans, the two edges of our state. But, that might be one way to make it a little more broadly applicable. Could we tease something out of those processes that could then be helpful as we look to other issues, whether it's urban heat islands or evolving science on any of these climate impacts, and how do we plan for and accommodate that changing science? That one's maybe a little trickier. But anyway, those are sort of three ideas sort of nebulously related to one another that emerged to me. Louis?
So I think you're on a good path. I think that's a good synthesis or extraction. I think with this issue of what is the AB 32 about adaptation has been around. People have been talking about it for a long time, and I think one of the things we lack is the clear metrics. It didn't come out of the TAG group, that I thought at some time there would have been better metrics or more discrete. So the other thing is the regulatory authority. There is a body, the Air Resources Board, who is empowered by law to issue regulations to mandate actions. So without a clear metric and without an identified entity that can issue regulations, I think it's a challenge. I'm not saying we shouldn't try to do it, but I think those are some issues that we have to overcome. And the storytelling to me is great. The case study plus the whole integration. If we can link that with the financing piece as well, where we can tell the story with equity, with the integration with mitigation, like Sakita talked about. And the sooner the better, because the conversations are underway, as Brian talked about on that. So that could be a short-term. When Ken asked this morning what short-term goal would be, a couple of tight case studies might be a good product.
Sorry. I think, and I don't know whether it goes with the adaptation, the AB 32 #1 or the #2 packaging a story, but I think one of the things at SAPA that we work really hard at is narrating that the watershed is the right scale for managing water. And I think it might be really valuable for us to be able to talk about what adaptation strategies belong at which scales, particularly in governance, and that then also narrates the integration between the scales. But like, what can cities do? What can regional entities do? Counties or whoever? What can the MPOs do? What can the state do? And like enunciating how adaptation sits at each of those scales in slightly different ways, then might help us find the integration component, like how those gears mesh. And I don't know where that sits, but I think that scale question can be really valuable for us to think about, because some things the state can do that a city can't do, and there's a lot of things the city can do that the state can't do. I guess that's pretty self-evident here.
Great. So just to kind of maybe look a little at what we might do about the case studies, I very much concur with your point. We don't want to do something that's just going to sit on a website. But I do think that getting back to, this diagram that we talked about at the beginning of the day, you see a tiny little blue dot. This is about trying to figure out where there are barriers and get rid of those barriers. And, we've got a lot of partners sitting around the table here right now who are already addressing climate change adaptation and resilience in their localities. So maybe a mix of, if we can get some of you all to agree to share an example of what you've already been through, and including some of the things that didn't work, and go from there kind of retrospectively, as well as if there's something that's ongoing right now that one of our local partners around the table or another partner that we could bring in would like to raise as a possibility to, in real time, have this commission be able to weigh in on a case study as it's moving forward, so we can learn from it as well as potentially provide some guidance, et cetera. I just wonder if that kind of more real-time case study engagement might be more useful than just mining for information and really trying to get the folks who are really engaged in it to contribute in real time. I realize that requires some bravery and some, putting some potential difficulties out for folks to see, but if we could work that out, seems like it could be really useful. Gloria?
Yeah, so I will certainly try to help on that end, at least with folks that we may know around the table, like maybe we can bring some useful case studies. One thing I just wanted to flag, though, like the reason that I raised my hand was I get what we mean, and this is just a matter of semantics and my own values around AB 32 for adaptation, but I just want to caution us to not necessarily have AB 32 as the standard, because while it was useful in generating and creating revenue and having this kind of cap and trade model, there were some fundamental flaws with it that we don't necessarily want to replicate. So I think that AB 32 can be both have some standards, but also things that we should be learning from. The one piece is that it had some type of corporate accountability in it to some degree, because there were a lot of loopholes. But yeah, so just for us to, it goes kind of back to where we started with being clear about our values and principles and what we're actually trying to accomplish and achieve, that I personally feel, along with a lot of other allies throughout the state, that AB 32 didn't necessarily fully do, although it did generate revenue. So that is one useful thing that did come out of it. The other part, in thinking about the metrics piece, that was kind of flawed with the model, is that it was not a lot of accountability, transparency, and reporting that happened. And so I think that's something that we also want to make sure that we are just not trying to replicate.
So I was just going to kind of concur with your citing of the sea level rise as a guidance process as opportunistic, because I think we're given as best of a gift as we could be given with that process time the way it is around this process. Sea level rise is one of those issues that impacts a whole lot more people than I think the processes in the past have really connected to. And we have programs in place right now to do kind of hand-holding at the local level around sea level rise that don't reach into all of the communities and local jurisdictions that are actually going to be impacted by sea level rise. So the current heavier involvement by the Delta Stewardship Council and the BCDC, I think, will be really helpful, and it kind of gives us a chance to pick a big issue and kind of show a contrasting response to how we've dealt with that issue in the past, and then we can show kind of our stakeholders how these impacts expand well beyond kind of who's the core engaging group, and then kind of reach out to them to try to bring more people in, and then use that as an example of success. So it's like an immediate chance to get some high-level success from a test case.
Just wanted to build on the case study discussion a little bit more. I agree generally with Brian that mining those case studies has sort of limited utility from the local government lens. What we at the local government level respond to are our local elected decision makers and their prioritization. Oftentimes case studies are populated on these websites by communities that have the resources to develop the case studies to put them on the websites, and that's voluntary. Now, if the group of elected folks that sit on the dais tell me to do a project, here's your funding, go to it, I will do that. However, what seems to, in my experience, to respond more positively, whether it's through the Association of Environmental Professionals or the American Planning Association or any of the other organizations I belong to, are recognition and awards. The people that are elected like to get recognition at their local level for projects that they put a lot of thought and energy and resources towards. What I'd rather see, instead of a library of case studies that is going to be very limited utility to the local governments for implementation, is really an opportunity to celebrate across the state, across varying diverse communities, the projects that either at the small scale or the large scale seemingly address these issues and are funded. And that kind of promotion really builds on itself and becomes more popular, and the people that are responsible for us getting budget and procuring opportunities for these types of projects and plans will then want to do that more frequently. So just from my perspective, I think that has more value than seemingly just populating a website with things that worked in certain communities.
Just wanted to echo what you brought up earlier, Luis, with kind of this playing at the interplay of the sea level rise, the tree mortality, urban heat island, et cetera. And I just don't want to miss, which I'm sure we're not, but just to make sure that we don't, what Ashley brought up earlier and what Kalei, I believe you were just mentioning, with the impacts of the sea level rise, particularly because the way that, at least in Southern California, we hear about it a lot is it impacts mostly more affluent communities who actually live on the coast. And so really wanting to understand how it's impacting urban centers and more disadvantaged areas.
Right. Just in terms of as consensus is formed around the case stories and the case studies, having a clear sense of who the target audience is would be helpful. But also with regards to just these two words, resiliency and adaptation. As much as we believe that they're commonly understood and known, they're not, and would be helpful to reinforce what these things are and what they mean to these different target audiences, and I think they'd be helpful. Thank you.
Just to reiterate that, I think some type of common definition around some of these things would be really good. I mean, you know, vulnerable communities is another one where within my city and county alone, there must be 10 different definitions of it. So I think some of those things could be really helpful too, and I think it helps with community organizations as well as local groups just to be able to understand and be able to participate in the conversation. So, and I like the idea of awards, by the way. That's sort of an interesting angle on that, you know. Why not? For recognition. Yeah.
Just to make sure it's
not lost. When Ashley was bringing up the case studies piece, I think she was also talking about not just having case studies to share information, but really highlighting, as you were saying, for a specific audience, and really thinking about who do we want to get the information in front of and to what end. And so the case studies, I think from what Ashley was saying was, is there a message around the value of taking adaptation efforts and taking steps in a certain way, and that advance certain principles or values, and what is the benefit of that, and being able to move policy or funding or financing conversation forward around that set of values, but highlighted through an example. So I think if there is an opportunity for us to do that and having a kind of real world case to demonstrate that, there's value, but again, not just case studies for case studies' sake, but just didn't want that to get lost.
Yeah, just to respond to that, when she brought up the issue of the idea of case studies, I thought she was talking about something that we could potentially present to the legislature. And in the context of something I think you brought, Sakita, up a little bit ago, and maybe others too, around how we better integrate the mitigation and the adaptation conversations together. There's a lot of funding in the world in the mitigation space and in the cap and reduction proceeds, and so how do we blend those? And I think the case studies could help sort of tease that out more. Bruce? Yeah.
Back to the goals and the vision. We have a faculty at Berkeley, David Sedlak, in engineering, of all places, who's one of our best communicators on these issues and on climate. And his talk actually has people kind of moving up to the front of their seat because he looks at California from the point of view that it's 2050 and we've solved the water challenges that we are facing, and then works backwards from there. What were the 5 big strategies that we employed to get there? Anyway, I think for adaptation, it would be, I think this group in a short term, couple of months or whatever, could come up with a draft of what California would look like in 2030 or whatever year we want to pick, that we have become fill in the blank here, a very resilient. we haven't slid off the map, whatever you want to have as the result, and then and populate that with some of the things that we're throwing out here that are practical. I mean, you talked about mandates. I mean, there could be a whole series of things that we could, I'd say, measure later. So it's not just a big vision, but I think that's something that we could contribute here, because I find, and many of you maybe do too, that it's still hard to talk to some people or many people about adaptation because you have to start with what you're even discussing. But if we can paint a picture in real life of what adaptation or resilience looks like, we could start to get at funding and a number of other issues.
So I wanted to step back and go back to my original comment this morning, and I guess I'm wondering from you, Nuantara and Louise, about your expectations for our group. Is when you presented the overall charge, you talked about the ICARP as having the clearinghouse and the advisory council. And so my question to you is there do you envision that the ICARP itself will be taking actions for which or upon which we will provide advice? And if you are acting as the ICARP within OPR, I don't know if you are constrained by the Bagley-Keene Act, which I think is relevant to the advisory committee, not to whatever other role you may be doing. So I guess I still have that question is how much doing you're looking for from this committee beyond advice, and how much work you might be doing on your own as the ICARP.
Well, I think the program is not a regulatory program. So we will not be passing new, we don't have any authority to start requiring anything new or anything. So our primary role at ICARP is going to be to really do more of the coordination across our entities across the state, and then also to the extent that we can through the tools that we have with local and regional governments, but through a primarily guidance type, advisory type of a role. But I think that is where this group is uniquely situated, is that we have, this group has the ability to put more behind what it is that we do. So we can go back to, at ICARP, we could be going back to state agencies and saying, as we coordinate a funding program or something like that, we have this group has put their heads together and said, from all of these perspectives, working with local, regional, community partners, these are the things that we think are really important, or here are examples of where it was done right, and these are the reasons we think it was done well. Or here's an example of where this was really good and this made it really tricky, or something like that. So what I view this group as being able to do is to really be able to put more oomph and sort of meat behind that coordinated action, why, and reason for why we would be doing it. Why would we want to push a certain partnership or a certain type of alignment across scale? I think that would come from the collective knowledge and input of this group. And I think if we say, I think Bruce's idea is terrific. This is what we want California to look like, and then working back, that could help us identify where are the places we really need to engage. And then this group can help us say, what does that engagement need to look like? And that's what this council can provide. That's sort of my one, take on it. Yeah. I see Mo.
Yeah, just picking on what Bruce said, really I see some of the work that we're going to be doing over the next year or further than that, especially in light of the federal government and some of the backward steps, in my opinion, that we might be seeing as far as climate and adaptation, is really building a state resiliency plan, for other states and other entities, other communities to look at how can they then look at climate adaptation and look at their own resiliency as a bigger community, and what is, I think we're going to be used as an example, just like we saw with NDRC. California stuck out. We had something different than other people did and that we were working on. But the things that we're accomplishing here in a big state like this, how can it be replicated in other states, and how can they get going on their own plan on a statewide level?
Okay, I also want to be mindful of the time because it's now 3:27, so we can decide in the next 3 minutes. No, I have a point of order.
Yes, we will put forward.
We'll put forward.
Next step, a public comment.
Like that.
And then the council can make decisions.
Oh.
Oh, like, sorry.
Oh.
I was
so.
But you're.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, basically we'll put forward next steps, open it to public comment, and then vote as a group.
And then open to general public comment if there are any about anything that is not on the agenda.
If folks feel comfortable, I could propose a few next steps. But this is a tricky thing to try to hone in. So what I'm going to do is maybe keep it a little high level. But I think a couple of maybe concrete next steps, and this maybe is for just even our next meeting, is that we agree that we want to start working on this vision or this 2050 idea about what it, or 2030, I'm not going to dictate the timeline, what we want to look like in the future. What does it mean if we are successful as a council and as a state in achieving integrated climate adaptation and resilience? So that could be a conversation. I think that is one next step. I think another piece is to start discussing something around the case study plus idea, which is now this, something about building that story, and also, but in a very targeted way, potentially, about to a specific audience that I think could tie in on the to the vision. that's another topic, sort of expanding on that case study plus idea. And then I think the other that I'm hearing is really how we take advantage of the sea level rise opportunity. And again, I think relates to the communications piece and the broader audience, but also maybe as a process that can help us as we look more, how do we model this engagement and integration?
And I would just add that in the interim between this and the next meeting, that we propose putting together work groups or work committees, subcommittees around those 3 different areas, and it would be voluntary for you to participate in one of those, and you can just contact, follow up with me directly about that, and then we can start thinking about what, at the next level of detail, what that actually looks like in terms of bringing work together around these 3 different areas back to the next meeting and sequence of meetings.
Yeah, just one. I guess I would say also following up on definitions that we should have heard, and maybe thinking about, I don't know if it's really in the case studies discussion or if it's in the future discussion, but I think the idea of looking at that incremental versus long-term costs and benefits, sort of understanding that, and I don't know if that may be more of a specialized thing, but being able to sort of understand the benefits of green infrastructure or reduced GHG, I mean, those types of things would be, maybe that's something that someone already has some research on at Berkeley or something that we could take advantage of, but that would be helpful.
So I would suggest we'll add the definitions piece, I think, maybe within the context of the visions and principles discussion there. Yeah, and then the other.
Okay.
So that's sort of 3 high-level elements of next steps. Probably the most concrete would be at the next meeting on the vision, principles, and elements there. That on the case studies and the sea level rise, that we can do some interim work to flesh those out a bit and bring it back. I think we as a group at OPR can do some sort of dive in on the vision piece and try to bring some material for us to all work from at the next meeting. And then in the interim, we can also, if there's work groups that want to form around any of these, we can do that. And just to get in touch with us, and we can handle the logistics piece of that. Okay. Do I need to phrase something?
So now,
okay. Kate.
But before we vote, we open it.
Yeah, is there any public comment? We've lost everyone. Hearing none. Oh, yeah.
You want this agenda item, yes. And then the general public comment will be after the vote.
Okay. You good, Tiff? Okay. Okay. We're going to vote on the work plan concept that Kate moved.
I so move these 3 items as next up.
Brian seconded. Kaylee thirded. Okay. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Abstain? Okay. All right. Okay, so with that, we will move to the final open public comment period of the meeting. Do we have any open or any public comment?
I just wanted to say I really applaud the work you're doing. I would ask that as you think about your work plan and charge going forward, that you think about that which is not being done by others. Adaptation is happening to all of us. It's being tackled by many, many people, and you guys have a unique opportunity with this charge to ask hard questions, and also look at the things that are not going to be looked at either because you're going to look out further or look more specifically. And I think it's embedded in what you're doing, but also you could get distracted with what I heard is some discussion on case studies and the stuff that I think others will do. So if you could reach further, that would be great.
Thank you. Any other comments? Okay, well with that, I just want to thank everyone again for joining us on this council and bearing with us and as we figure out everything we can do, but I think this has been a really productive meeting and really looking forward to working with everyone. So thank you. And our next meeting is June 16th. And if folks have ideas for that, please send them our way. And how to connect it.